Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never should have answered that radio call. 20 years as a park ranger, and I'd seen some strange things. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night in Yellowstone. It started with a routine missing persons report, but it ended with, well, I'm still not sure what I saw out there in the darkness. It was late September, and the park was winding down for the season. Most of the tourists had gone home, leaving behind only the hardcore campers and a few stragglers enjoying the fall colors. My partner, Sarah, and I were on a routine patrol when the call came in. Ranger station to Unit 7. Come in, Unit 7. I picked up the radio. This is Unit 7. Go ahead. We've got a report of 2 missing hikers in the Lamar Valley area. Last seen near the Specimen Ridge Trail. Families getting worried. Can you head out there and take a look? I glanced at Sarah, who nodded. 10-4. We're on our way. As we drove towards Lamar Valley, the sun was already dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Any other day, I would have stopped to admire the view. But today, there was a knot in my stomach that I couldn't shake. "What do you think, John?" Sarah asked, breaking the silence. "Another case of unprepared hikers," I shrugged. "Probably. You'd be surprised how many people underestimate the wilderness out here." We reached the trailhead just as twilight was setting in. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the first hints of winter. As we got out of the truck, I noticed something odd. It was quiet, too quiet. No bird song, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Sarah must have felt it too. "John," she whispered, "something's not right." I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. "Let's check the trail. They can't have gone far." We started up the path, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The beams swept across the ground, revealing nothing. No footprints, no signs of recent passage. It was as if the hikers had vanished into thin air. About a mile in, we came across a small clearing, and that's when things started to get weird. "John, over here!" Sarah called out. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her flashlight beam fixed on something on the ground. I jogged over, my breath catching in my throat as I saw what she'd found. It was a campsite, or what was left of one. A tent lay in shreds, its contents scattered across the clearing. Sleeping bags were torn to pieces, and a backpack had been ripped open, its contents spilling out onto the forest floor. "What the hell happened here?" I muttered, kneeling down to examine the damage. Sarah was circling the site, her flashlight beam sweeping the area. "John, look at this," she said, her voice tight with tension. I joined her, following her light to a set of tracks leading away from the campsite. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was seeing. The prints were huge, easily twice the size of a human foot. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. These tracks were different. They looked almost like a cross between a human footprint and an animal paw. "What kind of animal makes tracks like that?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head, unable to answer. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything like it. We followed the tracks to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the dense underbrush. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's hand went to her sidearm. "John, I hear it," I said, my own hand moving to my weapon. "Let's get back to the truck and call for backup." We turned to head back down the trail, but something made me pause. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement in the trees. I swung my flashlight towards it, and for a split second, I saw something. It was tall, much taller than a man, covered in dark, matted fur. But it was the eyes that haunted me, glowing in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly un-animal. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her down the trail. We sprinted through the darkness, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us at every step. Behind us, I could hear heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. Whatever was chasing us, it was big and it was fast. We burst out of the tree line near our truck, gasping for air. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. "John, hurry!" Sarah yelled, her eyes wide with fear as she stared out into the darkness. The engine roared to life just as a massive shape emerged from the trees. In the headlights, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer, a towering, hair-covered figure that walked on two legs but moved with an animal's grace. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and beast, with a protruding snout and teeth that gleamed in the artificial light. I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas, tires spinning in the gravel before we shot forward. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature pause at the edge of the parking lot, watching us go. Its eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and I swear I saw intelligence and hunger in that gaze. We drove in silence for several miles, both of us too shocked to speak. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. We have to report this," Sarah said. "Those hikers, that thing might have—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Back at the ranger station, we gave our report. To their credit, our superiors took us seriously. They organized a search party for the missing hikers and sent out alerts to all personnel to be on the lookout for any unusual activity. But as the days passed and no trace of the hikers was found, I could see the doubt creeping into people's eyes when we told our story. The tracks we'd seen were dismissed as belonging to a large bear. The destruction at the campsite was attributed to a grizzly attack, and the creature we'd seen, a trick of the light, they said, the product of fear and adrenaline. But I know what I saw that night. And sometimes, when I'm on patrol in the more remote areas of the park, I catch a glimpse of something moving just beyond the trees. I hear rustling in the underbrush that's too heavy to be a deer or elk. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that low, guttural growl echoing across the valley. I've spent my entire career telling people that the wilderness isn't something to fear, that with proper preparation and respect, nature can be enjoyed safely. But now I know better. There are things out there in the dark, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, when I look out into the vastness of Yellowstone, I can't shake the feeling that we're not at the top of the food chain after all. So if you're planning a trip to Yellowstone, by all means, come and enjoy the beauty of the park. But remember, stick to the trails, keep your wits about you, and whatever you do, don't go wandering off into the wilderness alone, because you never know what might be watching from the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. As for me, I still patrol the park, still do my job, but I never go into the backcountry without a partner anymore, and I always keep one eye on the tree line, because I know the truth now. There are monsters in these woods, and they're hungry. Story 2. I've been a hunter all my life, but after what happened in northern Michigan last winter, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. They say that when you hunt, you're not just tracking your prey, you're testing yourself against nature. But what we encountered out there in the frozen wilderness wasn't natural. It was something ancient, something hungry, and it turned our hunting trip into a nightmare I'll never forget. It started innocently enough. Me and 3 of my oldest buddies, Mike, Dave, and Tom, had been planning this trip for months. We'd rented a remote cabin up in the Upper Peninsula, miles from the nearest town. The plan was simple: a week of deer hunting, drinking beer, and escaping the pressures of our everyday lives. Little did we know that we'd end up fighting for our lives against something straight out of a horror movie. We arrived at the cabin on a crisp November afternoon. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and wood smoke, and a thin layer of snow already covered the ground. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, just a two-room affair with a pot-bellied stove for heat and a generator for electricity. But it was ours for the week, and we quickly set about making ourselves at home. That first night, we sat around the fire, trading stories and sipping whiskey. The mood was light, full of the anticipation of the hunt to come. As we turned in for the night, I remember thinking how peaceful it was out here, away from the noise and bustle of the city. If only I'd known what was waiting for us in the darkness. The first sign that something was off came the next morning. We'd set out at dawn, splitting up to cover more ground. I'd been in my stand for a couple of hours when I heard it, a series of sharp cracks echoing through the forest, followed by an unearthly shriek that made my blood run cold. It wasn't any animal call I'd ever heard before, and believe me, I've heard plenty. I radioed the others, but they hadn't heard anything. We chalked it up to the strange acoustics of the winter forest and went about our day. But that night, as we gathered back at the cabin, everyone seemed on edge. "You guys see anything weird out there today?" Mike asked as we cleaned our rifles. Dave shrugged. "Not really. Saw some tracks I couldn't identify, but that's about it." "What kind of tracks?" I asked, my mind flashing back to that strange cry I'd heard. "Dunno," Dave replied. Too big for a coyote, but didn't look like a wolf either. Almost looked like, well, you're gonna think I'm crazy, but they almost looked human. Except, huge." We all laughed it off, but I could see the unease in everyone's eyes. Something felt off, but none of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. The next day, things took a turn for the worse. We'd decided to hunt in pairs, just to be on the safe side. Me and Tom were working a ridge about a mile from the cabin when we came across something that stopped us in our tracks. It was a deer carcass, or what was left of one. The animal had been torn apart, its ribcage splayed open and organs scattered across the snow. But it wasn't the gore that disturbed me. I've field-dressed plenty of deer in my time. No, what sent a chill down my spine was the way it had been killed. This wasn't the work of a wolf or a bear. The deer looked like it had been ripped apart by something with hands. "Jesus," Tom whispered, his face pale. "What could have done this?" I shook my head, unable to answer. That's when we heard it. That same shriek from the day before, but closer this time, much closer. We radioed Mike and Dave, telling them to get back to the cabin immediately. As Tom and I hurried through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack of a branch sounded like footsteps. Back at the cabin, we compared notes. Mike and Dave had found similar carcasses on their side of the property. Whatever was out there, it was big, it was strong, and it was hungry. "Maybe we should pack up and head out," Dave suggested, voicing what we were all thinking. But Mike shook his head. "It's already getting dark. We're safer here than trying to navigate those roads at night. First thing in the morning, we'll head out." We all agreed, but none of us slept easy that night. The wind had picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin like a lost soul, and underneath it all, I swear I could hear something moving out there in the darkness, circling our little haven of light. Morning couldn't come fast enough. We were up before dawn, packing our gear as quickly as we could. That's when Tom, who was loading up the truck, let out a yell that made us all jump. "Guys, you need to see this!" We rushed outside, and my heart sank. The truck's tires had been slashed, the engine compartment torn open like a tin can. Whatever had done this had to be incredibly strong and incredibly smart. "What the hell are we gonna do now?" Dave asked, his voice cracking with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard it, that bone-chilling shriek, closer than ever, and this time it was answered by another cry, then another. There was more than one of them out there. "Back inside," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. "And then we need to barricade the doors and windows." We worked quickly, pushing furniture against the doors and boarding up the windows. All the while, those cries got closer and closer. As the sun rose, casting long shadows through the trees, we caught our first glimpse of what we were up against. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a gaunt, emaciated body covered in patchy fur. Its antlers were massive, stretching up and out like gnarled branches. But it was the face that haunted me, a twisted, almost human visage with sunken eyes that glowed with an unnatural hunger. "Wendigo," Tom whispered, his face ashen. "My grandfather used to tell stories about them. I always thought they were just legends." The creature let out another piercing cry, and suddenly the woods around the cabin were alive with movement. There wasn't just one. There were at least half a dozen of them, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. What followed was the longest day of my life. We took turns watching the windows, our rifles at the ready. The Wendigos would rush the cabin, their claws scrabbling at the boards we'd nailed up, then retreat back into the woods. Each time they seemed to get a little closer, a little bolder. As night fell, we knew we couldn't stay in the cabin. Our food was running low, and it was only a matter of time before the creatures found a way in. We had to make a run for it. "There's an old fire tower about 5 miles south of here," Mike said, poring over our map. "If we can make it there, we might be able to call for help." It was a desperate plan, but it was all we had. We gathered what supplies we could carry and prepared to make our move. The Wendigos had been quiet for the past hour. Maybe, just maybe, we could slip away unnoticed. We stepped out into the moonlit night, the snow crunching under our boots. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came that terrible shriek. "Run!" I yelled, and we took off into the woods. What followed was a nightmare of darkness and fear. We crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind us. Every so often, one of the creatures would get close enough that I could hear its labored breathing, smell its rotten stench. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that frozen hell. But gradually, I realized something was wrong. The sounds of pursuit were fading, but so were the sounds of my friends. I stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. I was alone. Somehow, in the chaos of our flight, we'd been separated. "Mike, Dave, Tom," I called out, my voice echoing in the still night air. There was no answer, just the quiet of the forest, and, in the distance, that haunting cry. I was lost, alone, and being hunted by creatures I'd always thought were just campfire stories. But I knew I couldn't give up. My friends were out there somewhere, and I had to find them. As I stumbled through the snow, trying to get my bearings, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees. The fire tower. I'd made it. But as I approached, my heart sank. The tower was old, abandoned, its ladder rotted away. That's when I heard it. The sound of something large moving through the underbrush behind me. I turned slowly, and there it was. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the clearing, its antlers silhouetted against the moon. Those glowing eyes fixed on me, filled with an ancient, terrible hunger. As it stepped towards me, I raised my rifle. I don't know if bullets can stop a Wendigo, but I was damn sure going to try, because that's the thing about hunting. Sometimes you're the hunter, and sometimes you're the prey. But as long as you're still breathing, you never stop fighting. The Wendigo let out a roar that shook the trees. I took aim, my finger tightening on the trigger. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. This hunt was far from over. Story 3. I used to think the scariest thing in the Ozarks was getting lost in its vast wilderness. That was before the camping trip that changed everything, before the night we realized we weren't alone in those ancient hills, before we learned that sometimes the forest has teeth. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and my 3 best friends from college, Alyssa, Marcus, and Jen, reconnecting with nature and each other. We'd chosen a remote spot in the heart of the Ozarks, far from the usual tourist trails. The kind of place where you could really feel the weight of the wilderness around you. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the tree-covered hills. The campsite was perfect, a small clearing next to a burbling stream, surrounded by towering oaks and pines. As we set up our tents, I remember thinking how peaceful it was. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a bird. This is exactly what I needed, Alyssa sighed as we sat around the campfire that night, roasting marshmallows and trading stories. And no cell service, no emails, just us and the great outdoors. We all nodded in agreement. It felt good to be disconnected, to feel like we were the only people for miles around. If only we'd known how true that was, and how much we'd come to wish it wasn't. The first sign that something was off came early the next morning. I was the first one up, eager to get the coffee going. As I stepped out of my tent, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Our food cache, a large cooler and several bags we'd hung from a tree branch to keep away from bears, had been raided. The cooler lay on its side, its contents strewn across the forest floor. The bags hung in tatters, scraps of fabric fluttering in the morning breeze, but it was the footprints that made my blood run cold. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own feet, and they didn't look quite human. They were too elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. "Guys," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, "you need to see this." As my friends emerged from their tents, rubbing sleep from their eyes, I pointed out the destruction and the tracks. Marcus, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "Must be a bear," he said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We all knew bear tracks, and these weren't it. "Let's just pack up and head out," Jen suggested, eyeing the surrounding woods nervously. "We can find somewhere else to camp." It seemed like a sensible idea. But when Marcus went to start the car, it wouldn't turn over. The engine just clicked uselessly, no matter how many times he tried. "Battery's dead," he announced, slamming the hood shut in frustration. Must have left something on overnight. We spent the next hour trying to get the car started, checking connections, attempting to jump it with the portable charger we'd brought for our phones. Nothing worked. As the day wore on, a sense of unease settled over our camp like a heavy fog. "Okay, let's think this through," Alyssa said, as we gathered around the cold remains of last night's fire. "We're about 10 miles from the nearest road. One of us could hike out, try to flag down some help." It was a good plan, but none of us liked the idea of splitting up. In the end, we decided to wait it out. We had enough food left for another day or two. Even with the raid on our supplies, surely someone would come looking for us if we didn't return on schedule. As night fell, we huddled close to the fire, jumping at every snapping twig and rustle in the underbrush. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful just a day ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. Shadows danced at the edge of our firelight, and more than once I could have sworn I saw something moving just beyond the trees. It was around midnight when we heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, a sound that spoke of hunger and ancient, primal rage. "Ubi, what was that?" Jen whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before anyone could answer, we heard heavy footsteps circling our camp. Whatever it was big, and it was getting closer. "Get in the tents," I hissed, grabbing a burning branch from the fire to use as a makeshift torch. "Now!" We scrambled for the relative safety of our nylon shelters, zipping ourselves in as if that flimsy barrier could protect us from whatever was out there. Through the tent walls, I could see the bobbing light of my torch as Marcus held it aloft, scanning the tree line. Suddenly, there was a loud crash. I peeked out to see our remaining food supplies scattered across the ground, the creature having torn through the ropes, holding them up like they were tissue paper. In the flickering torchlight, I caught a glimpse of our tormentor, a massive, hair-covered form that walked on two legs but moved with an animal's grace. It turned its head towards us, and I saw eyes gleaming with an intelligence that was decidedly un-animal. For hours, we huddled in our tents, listening to the creature moving around our camp. It seemed to be toying with us, getting close enough that we could hear its heavy breathing, then retreating back into the woods. None of us slept. How could we, knowing that thing was out there? As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the noises finally stopped. We cautiously emerged from our tents, half expecting to be attacked at any moment. But the clearing was empty, save for the destruction left behind by our nighttime visitor. "Do we need to get out of here?" Alyssa said, her voice shaking. "Now, before it comes back." No one argued. We quickly packed what we could carry, leaving behind the tents and most of our gear. As we prepared to leave, Marcus made one last attempt to start the car. To our amazement, it roared to life. "I don't understand," he said, staring at the dashboard in disbelief. "I tried everything yesterday. It was completely dead." "Who cares?" Jen said, already climbing into the back seat. "Let's just go." As we pulled out of the clearing, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw something standing at the edge of the trees. Something tall and hairy, watching us leave. But then we rounded a bend, and the campsite disappeared from view. We drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we hit the main road that anyone spoke. What do you think that thing was?" Alyssa asked quietly. I shook my head. "I don't know, but I've heard stories, legends about creatures in these hills. Things that aren't quite human, aren't quite animal. Things that have been here since before the first settlers arrived." "You mean like Bigfoot?" Marcus scoffed, but there was no real conviction in his voice. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe something older, something that doesn't have a name." We fell silent again after that. What else was there to say? We'd gone into those woods thinking we were at the top of the food chain. We'd left knowing better. As we drove back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd had a brush with something ancient and terrifying, something that didn't belong in our modern world of smartphones and social media. Something that reminded us that no matter how advanced we think we are, nature still holds secrets that can shake us to our core. I've been back to the Ozarks since then. The forest is still beautiful, still peaceful on the surface. But now I know what lurks in its depths. I know that sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness, you're not just visiting nature. You're entering someone else's territory. And not all the inhabitants are willing to share. So if you find yourself in the Ozarks, enjoy the beauty. Breathe in the fresh air and marvel at the ancient trees. But remember, you're not alone out there. And when night falls, stay close to your fire, because in the darkness beyond, something might be watching, something might be hungry, and it just might decide that you look like the perfect midnight snack. Story 4. I've been a father for 12 years, but nothing in my life prepared me for that day in the Boundary Waters. What started as a simple father-son fishing trip turned into a fight for survival against something that shouldn't exist. I've replayed those terrifying hours in my mind 1,000 times, and I still can't believe we made it out alive. It was supposed to be a chance for me to bond with my son, Jake. He'd just turned 13, and I figured a week of canoeing and fishing in the wilderness would be the perfect way to connect before he hit those difficult teenage years. The Boundary Waters canoe area. Wilderness seemed like the ideal spot. Pristine lakes, abundant fish, and a chance to really get away from it all. We set out early on a crisp September morning, our canoe loaded with gear and high spirits. Jake was excited, his face beaming as he helped me paddle across the clear, calm waters. The scenery was breathtaking, dense forests lining the shores, the cry of loons echoing across the water, and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. "This is awesome, Dad," Jake exclaimed as we glided across our third lake of the day. I couldn't help but smile, feeling like I'd finally done something right as a father. We made good progress that first day, setting up camp on a small island as the sun began to dip below the tree line. After a dinner of fresh-caught walleye and campfire potatoes, we sat by the shore, watching the stars come out one by one. "You think there are any monsters in these lakes, Dad?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. I chuckled, ruffling his hair. "Nah, buddy, just fish and the occasional curious beaver. Nothing to worry about out here." If only I'd known how wrong I was. The next day dawned bright and clear. We broke camp early, eager to reach a spot I'd heard was great for bass fishing. As we paddled, I noticed Jake kept glancing at the shoreline, his brow furrowed. "Everything okay, bud?" I asked. He hesitated before answering. I thought I saw something moving in the trees back there. Something big. I scanned the shore, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Probably just a deer, I reassured him. They're pretty common around here. We reached our fishing spot around midday. It was a beautiful little cove, surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows across the water. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour when it happened. The attack came out of nowhere. One moment, we were peacefully casting our lines. The next, something massive erupted from the water beside our canoe. I caught a glimpse of dark, matted fur and gleaming teeth before our world turned upside down. The canoe flipped, dumping us into the frigid water. As I surfaced, sputtering and disoriented, my first thought was for Jake. "Jake!" I yelled, spinning around frantically. "Jake, where are you?" His head popped up a few yards away, coughing and scared but alive. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Something large was moving in the water between us, creating waves that rocked me back and forth. "Swim for shore!" I shouted, already striking out for the nearest bank. I could hear Jake splashing behind me, his breaths coming in panicked gasps. As I swam, I became aware of something following us. I could hear it moving through the water, much faster than any human could swim. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Bear. No, bears don't attack boats like that. Moose. Possible. But it didn't look like any moose I'd ever seen. My feet finally touched bottom, and I staggered onto the rocky shore. Turning, I saw Jake just a few yards behind me, his face pale with fear. But it was what I saw beyond him that made my blood run cold. A massive head broke the surface, followed by shoulders that were far too broad to belong to any normal animal. As the creature rose from the water, I saw that it walked on two legs, its body covered in thick, dark fur. It stood easily 8 feet tall, with long arms that ended in wickedly curved claws. "Jake, run!" I screamed, rushing back into the water to grab my son. I pulled him onto the shore just as the creature lunged forward, its claws raking the spot where Jake had been moments before. We took off into the forest, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear the thing behind us, moving with impossible speed for something so large. Trees shook as it passed, and its heavy breathing seemed to fill the air around us. "Dad, what is that thing?" Jake gasped as we ran. "I don't know, son," I panted. "Just keep running." We burst into a small clearing, and I quickly scanned our surroundings. There, about 50 yards away, was a rocky outcropping that rose above the tree line. It was our best chance. "Head for those rocks," I told Jake, pushing him ahead of me. "We can climb up there." We made it to the base of the outcropping just as the creature crashed into the clearing behind us. I boosted Jake up onto the first ledge, then scrambled up after him, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the rough stone. The creature reached the rocks just as we climbed out of reach. It reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that shook the very ground beneath us. I got my first clear look at its face, a nightmarish blend of bear and ape, with intelligent eyes that burned with hunger and rage. "Do you keep climbing?" I urged Jake, trying to keep my voice steady. We made our way higher up the rocks, the creature pacing below us, occasionally making attempts to climb up after us. But the rocks were too steep, too smooth for its claws to find purchase. As we huddled on a narrow ledge near the top of the outcropping, I tried to make sense of what was happening. The creature below us defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a wolf, wasn't anything I'd ever seen or heard of before. Yet here it was, all too real and all too intent on making us its next meal. Hours passed. The sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. Any other time it would have been a beautiful sight. Now it filled me with dread. What would happen when night fell? Would the creature be able to climb up in the darkness? "Dad," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "What are we going to do?" I pulled him close, trying to comfort him despite my own fear. "We'll be okay, buddy. We just need to wait it out. It'll get bored eventually and wander off." But as the last light faded from the sky, the creature showed no signs of giving up. It continued to circle the base of our rocky refuge, occasionally testing the lower ledges for any sign of weakness. The night was long and cold. We huddled together for warmth, jumping at every sound from below. Several times I heard the creature's claws scraping against rock as it made renewed attempts to reach us. Each time I held my breath, praying the stone would hold. As dawn broke, I peered over the edge of our ledge. The creature was still there, sitting at the base of the rocks, its eyes fixed on our position. But something had changed. It seemed wary, uncertain. That's when I heard it, the distant buzz of an outboard motor. Someone was coming. The creature heard it too. It rose to its feet, head swiveling towards the sound. For a moment, it stood there, as if weighing its options. Then, with one last baleful glance in our direction, it turned and loped off into the forest. We stayed on our rocky perch until the boat came into view, a Forest Service patrol checking on campers. As we climbed down on shaky legs, I tried to figure out how I was going to explain what had happened. Who would believe us? In the end, we told them we'd capsized and gotten lost, trying to find our way back to camp. It was easier than trying to describe the impossibility of what we'd encountered, but as we motored back across the lake, I kept scanning the shoreline, half expecting to see a large, fur-covered shape watching us from the trees. We never did go back to the boundary waters. Jake lost his taste for camping after that, and honestly, so did I. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of that creature's roar echoing in my mind. I know what we saw that day. I know it was real, and I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness of the boundary waters, something is lurking. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that reminds us that we're not always at the top of the food chain. So if you're planning a trip to the boundary waters, by all means, go. Enjoy the beauty, the solitude, the connection with nature. But keep your wits about you. And if you're out on the water and you see something large moving beneath the surface, well, maybe it's best to paddle the other way, because sometimes the monsters from our nightmares turn out to be all too real. Story 5. There's something about the forest at night that gets under your skin, even when you've worked in it for years. I've been a park ranger long enough to know every trail, every tree, every bend in the river. You'd think the familiarity would bring comfort, but there's a certain kind of darkness that settles in when the sun dips below the horizon and the forest seems to hold its breath. That's when the unease creeps in. The kind that tells you maybe you're not as alone as you think. It started with the calls, local hikers reporting strange screams echoing through the forest near the backcountry trails. At first, we chalked it up to animal activity, bobcats, maybe even a mountain lion. They can make noises that'll turn your blood cold if you don't know what you're hearing. But something about these calls didn't sit right with me. They didn't come from any of the usual hotspots. And they weren't regular. They'd come out of nowhere. One minute the forest would be quiet, the next, these horrible, gut-wrenching screams would tear through the air. So, when my supervisor told me to check it out, I wasn't exactly thrilled, but it's my job. Head out, take a look, and most likely find nothing. That's what I told myself. I loaded up the truck just before dusk. The sky already starting to bleed orange and purple. I figured I'd head out to the section of forest where the calls had been coming from, do a sweep, and be back at the station before midnight. Easy enough. At least, that's what I thought. The drive up was uneventful, the gravel road crunching under the tires. The forest on either side was dense, a wall of shadow stretching as far as the eye could see. Every now and then, I'd catch a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, deer, maybe a raccoon, but it always seemed too quick, too fluid to be anything that belonged in the woods. I reached the trailhead just as the last light faded. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, stepping out into the cool night air. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, heavy silence. It felt like the trees were watching me, waiting for something. I set off down the trail, my flashlight casting long, narrow beams through the trees. The dirt path was familiar, one I'd walked 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. The trees seemed to loom taller, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes overhead. The further I walked, the tighter my chest felt, like the air itself was pressing in around me. About half an hour in, I heard it. At first it was distant, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it grew louder, an agonizing, drawn-out scream that sent a chill straight down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. That wasn't an animal, that wasn't something I'd ever heard before in all my years in the forest. I radioed in, my voice sounding shaky, even to me. "I think I heard something," I said, my throat dry. "Could be an injured hiker. I'm going to check it out." The response crackled back, but it was just static. The signal was weak this deep in the forest, so I wasn't surprised. Still, the silence that followed was unnerving. I moved off the trail, following the sound. It was hard to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to bounce off the trees, echoing through the forest like it was everywhere at once. The deeper I went, the worse the smell got. It was faint at first, but now it was overwhelming, like something had died and been left to rot in the sun. I gagged, pulling my shirt up over my nose as I pushed through the underbrush. The scream came again, closer this time. My pulse quickened as I reached a small clearing, my flashlight sweeping over the ground. There were claw marks, deep gouges in the dirt and up the sides of the trees, like something huge had raked its claws across them. My stomach churned. Whatever had made those marks wasn't something I wanted to meet. Then I saw it, mangled animal carcasses scattered across the ground. Deer, rabbits, even what looked like the remains of a bear, all torn apart and half-eaten. Blood soaked the earth, the metallic stench filling my nose and making my stomach turn. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. This wasn't the work of a bear or a wolf. Something else had done this, something vicious and large, far too large. The scream ripped through the air again, so close I felt the vibrations in my chest. I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of movement just beyond the tree line. A shadow, massive, hulking, moving through the trees, too fast for something that size. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Who's there?" I shouted, but my voice sounded small, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. There was no response, just the eerie silence that followed. I fumbled for my radio, the static still crackling on the other end. "This is Ranger Price," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at the northern clearing, and there's something out here. I need backup." No response, just static. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, circling the clearing. They crunched over the fallen leaves and broken branches, slow and methodical. My flashlight swung wildly as I tried to pinpoint the source, but it was like the darkness itself was alive, swallowing up anything outside the narrow beam of light. I backed up until I felt the rough bark of a tree against my spine, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Whatever it was toying with me, hunting me. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It came from the shadows, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw it. Eyes, glowing red in the darkness, watching me from between the trees. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature stepped forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its silhouette. It stood on two legs, towering over me, covered in matted fur, its shoulders hunched and arms long enough to drag the ground. Its face, its face was twisted into something between a wolf and a man, with a snout full of jagged teeth and eyes that burned with hunger. I didn't think. I bolted, sprinting back toward the trail as fast as my legs would carry me, branches whipping at my face, the sound of heavy footsteps thundering behind me. It was close, too close. I could hear its breath, ragged and wet, like it was inches away from the back of my neck. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trees blurred past me as I broke through the underbrush, finally stumbling back onto the trail. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else as I ran, the heavy footfalls growing fainter but never disappearing. I reached the truck, throwing myself inside and slamming the door just as a deafening roar erupted from the trees. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life. I floored it, the tires spinning on the gravel as I sped away from the trailhead, glancing in the rearview mirror. For a second, I thought I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me with those glowing eyes. But I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I was back at the station, slamming the truck into park and stumbling out, my heart still racing. Back inside, the lights felt too bright, too artificial compared to the oppressive darkness of the forest. I collapsed into a chair, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I reported what I saw, of course, but they didn't believe me, just wrote it off as exhaustion, maybe a wild animal I misidentified. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. And now, every time the sun sets and the forest goes quiet, I can't help but wonder if it's still watching, still waiting for the next person foolish enough to step into its territory. Story 6. They say the wilderness is peaceful, a place to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. But the peace I felt in the woods on that trip was different. It was the kind of peace that swallows everything, sound, movement, even light. The kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. Looking back now, I should have trusted that instinct. We were supposed to be out there for 2 nights. Just a few of us, me, Matt, Jess, and her boyfriend Danny, camping off-grid in the forest to escape the usual noise. Jess and Danny had found the spot during one of their weekend hikes, and Matt had convinced me to tag along. "You need a break," he'd said, half laughing. He wasn't wrong. I was burnt out from work and thought a few days in the woods might help reset everything, but the woods weren't as inviting as I'd expected. The first night was normal enough. We set up camp near a small clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees that stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the temperature dropped fast. We sat around the fire, drinking cheap beer and swapping stories, laughing at Jess's exaggerated retelling of how Danny once got lost on a marked trail. We were a good ways off from the main hiking paths. No one else around for miles. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, but the quiet had a weight to it that felt wrong. The fire crackled as Matt stoked it, sending a flurry of sparks into the air. The night had settled in thick, and the forest was alive with the usual sounds, crickets chirping, branches creaking in the wind. But every now and then, those sounds would stop, and for a few long moments, the only noise would be the fire, the crackling wood breaking the silence. It wasn't until later, when the fire was just embers and the chill of the night had fully set in, that things started to feel off. I was half asleep in my tent, bundled in my sleeping bag, when I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was close, just outside the tents. A soft rustling, like something was moving through the underbrush. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon maybe, but then the sound stopped, replaced by something heavier, something dragging through the dirt. My heart kicked into high gear, and I held my breath, listening intently. The dragging sound grew closer, then stopped again, right outside. I could hear my pulse in my ears, and I strained to listen for any movement, any sign of what it could be. I shifted in my sleeping bag, trying to get a better angle to peer through the tent's mesh window, but it was pitch black outside. The fire had died out completely, and without any moonlight breaking through the trees, I could barely make out anything beyond a few feet. The rustling started up again, moving away from the tents, slowly disappearing into the darkness of the woods. By morning, the sounds were just a vague memory, and I chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by the isolation. But when we crawled out of the tents, Matt was the first to notice the tracks. "Hey, what the hell is this?" he said, crouching low near the edge of the clearing. We all wandered over, wiping the sleep from our eyes. At first, I thought it was nothing, just disturbed dirt, but then I saw them, footprints, huge, clear footprints that were too large, too deep to be human, and they weren't shaped like boots or shoes. They looked like they belonged to something else. The prints were wide, with 4 distinct claw marks at the toes, dug deep into the ground like whatever made them weighed a ton. They circled around the tents and stretched off into the trees, disappearing into the underbrush. "Bear," Danny suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "No way," Jess said, shaking her head. "Bears don't come this close to campsites, especially not this time of year." We all stared at the tracks for a moment, unsure of what to make of them. Matt muttered something about wildlife, but I could tell from his face that he wasn't sure either. There was something unsettling about the way the tracks moved. Too calculated, too intentional. They weren't random. Despite the strange find, we decided to stay for the second night. Danny and Jess spent most of the day hiking, while Matt and I hung back at camp, trying to figure out how to explain the prints. Maybe it was a freak occurrence, some unknown animal passing through, but that nagging feeling, the one that had crept in the night before, was back, and this time it was stronger. That night, the air felt different. The usual sounds of the forest were absent. No crickets, no rustling of leaves in the wind, just silence. We tried to ignore it, talking around the fire again, but the unease was palpable. As we sat there, I noticed Matt staring out past the tree line, squinting into the dark. "You see that?" he whispered, his voice tight. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. "What?" "Eyes," he said quietly, his voice low. "I thought I saw eyes, red, in the trees." The others laughed it off, but I didn't. I'd felt it too, felt the weight of something watching us, something that didn't belong. Matt shrugged it off eventually, but I noticed he didn't take his eyes off the tree line for the rest of the night. When we finally turned in for the night, I lay awake in my tent, my ears straining to catch any sound, any movement. Hours passed in suffocating silence, and just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. The dragging. This time, it was unmistakable, louder than the night before. Something was circling the camp again. I could hear it moving just beyond the tents, dragging itself through the dirt, slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, and I glanced toward the others' tents, wondering if they were hearing it too. Then there was a soft sound, something like a snort, low and guttural. It was close, too close. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat, and reached for my flashlight. The second the beam cut through the darkness, the sound stopped, total silence. I swept the light across the clearing, but saw nothing. No movement, no eyes, just the same twisted trees, the same dead silence. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my nerves on edge, listening for any sign that whatever had been out there might come back. But it didn't. By morning, everyone was on edge. We didn't talk much, just packed up camp in silence, but as we were loading the last of our gear into our packs, I noticed something strange. The path we had hiked in on, the only way back to the main trail, was different. The trail had been clear when we arrived, but now it was nearly impassable. The underbrush was thicker, the trees closer together, and large branches had fallen across the path like some kind of barrier. "Did a storm come through?" Jess asked, her voice unsteady. "No," Matt said, his face pale. "I didn't hear any wind, no rain last night." Danny tried to move one of the branches, but it was heavy, too heavy for just one of us to lift. We worked together to clear the path, but the entire time I had the distinct feeling that we were being watched. That same creeping sense of unease had wrapped itself around me, and it wouldn't let go. It took us nearly twice as long to get back to the main trail. None of us spoke much during the hike, the tension thick in the air. Every so often, I'd catch Matt glancing behind us, like he was expecting to see something there. And honestly, I couldn't blame him. I kept feeling that same prickle on the back of my neck, like eyes were following us from the trees. When we finally made it back to the car, relief washed over me. But as we loaded the last of the gear into the trunk, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't done with us, that whatever had been watching us Whatever had left those prints was still out there, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting. Matt was the last to get in the car, his eyes scanning the tree line one more time before he closed the door. "You guys hear it too, right?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" Jess said, frowning. He paused, his expression tense. That silence. We all stopped, listening. He was right. The forest was dead silent again. No birds, no wind, no sounds of life. Just that same suffocating stillness that had followed us the entire trip. As we pulled away from the trailhead, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror one last time. The trees loomed tall and dark, and for a split second I thought I saw it. Something massive just beyond the shadows, watching us leave. We didn't talk about the trip after that. Not really. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear it. The sound of something moving through the woods, dragging itself closer, watching from the trees, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to stumble into its territory. Story 7. There's something about camping alone that makes everything seem sharper. The air feels crisper, the night darker, and every single sound, no matter how small, seems amplified. I'd done solo trips before, plenty of them, but this time was different. I felt it the moment I stepped foot onto the trailhead, like the forest was watching. I had decided to camp by a lake up in the mountains, a spot far enough from the usual campsites that I'd have it to myself. That's what I was looking for, after all. Complete isolation. Just me, my gear, and the wilderness. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise of life, a chance to clear my head and recharge. The hike up had been uneventful, beautiful even. The sun filtering through the trees, birds chirping overhead, the scent of pine and damp earth all around me. By the time I reached the lake, the late afternoon sun was casting a golden glow over the water, and I felt a brief sense of peace wash over me. I set up my tent near the shore, gathered some firewood, and prepared to settle in for a quiet evening. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lake, that feeling of unease crept in again. It was subtle at first, just a small knot in my stomach that I tried to ignore. The forest had grown quiet, the usual chatter of birds and insects, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just nerves from being out here alone. Nothing I hadn't felt before, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got worse. It started as I was sitting by the fire, eating a quick meal of dried fruit and jerky, a shadow just at the edge of my vision. I glanced up, but there was nothing there, just the trees standing tall and silent in the fading light. I shook my head and went back to my food. Then I saw it again, a flicker of movement, something dark and large moving between the trees. I stood up, my heart beating a little faster now, and grabbed my flashlight. I shone the beam into the woods, sweeping it back and forth, but again there was nothing, just the same stillness, the same quiet that seemed to stretch on forever. I told myself it was probably just an animal, a deer maybe, or a bear moving through the forest. I had seen plenty of wildlife on these trips before, but something about the way that shadow had moved didn't sit right with me. It was too fast, too fluid, like it was gliding between the trees. As night fully settled in, the sense of unease gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, the crackling of the wood, but my mind kept drifting back to that shadow, to the way the forest had fallen unnaturally silent. I scanned the tree line again and again, telling myself I was being paranoid. The fire eventually died down to embers, and I crawled into my tent, pulling my sleeping bag up to my chin. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches overhead, and I found myself straining to hear anything else, anything unusual. Then it came. That sound, faint at first, like something dragging through the underbrush. A low, deliberate scraping noise just outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, every muscle tensing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal rummaging through the leaves. It was something else. The sound stopped, and for a moment Everything was still. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. Then the scraping started again, closer this time. Something heavy brushing against the side of the tent, almost like it was testing it, feeling its way around. My pulse quickened, and I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly in my shaking hand. I waited. The sound stopped again, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I wanted to unzip the tent, shine the light outside and see what was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still, stay quiet, and then I heard the breathing. It was low, guttural, and far too close. A deep, rasping inhale, followed by a slow exhale, like whatever it was standing just outside the tent, listening. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my thumb hovering over the switch, but I still couldn't move. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I waited, listening, my entire body tense with fear. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Eventually, exhaustion overtook the fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep, my mind racing with half-formed nightmares. I woke up just before dawn, the pale light of morning filtering through the tent. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, wondering if it had all been a dream. But when I sat up and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool morning air, the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. The ground around the tent was disturbed, large, deep impressions in the dirt, like something heavy had been moving around all night. My heart sank as I traced the path of the tracks. They circled the tent, over and over again, like something had been watching, waiting. I followed the tracks a little further, my breath catching in my throat when I realized they didn't lead back into the woods. They led straight to the lake, and there, at the water's edge, the tracks stopped. But the water was disturbed, ripples gently lapping against the shore, as if something had recently slipped beneath the surface. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them comforting. Whatever had been out there last night, it wasn't an animal. I didn't know what it was, but the way it had moved, the way it had circled my tent so deliberately, made my skin crawl. I packed up quickly, my hands trembling as I stuffed my gear into my backpack. I kept glancing toward the lake, half expecting to see something rise from the water, something massive and dark. But there was nothing, just the quiet lapping of the water and the eerie stillness of the trees. As I hiked back down the trail, that feeling of being watched never left me. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch longer, darker, and every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustling of branches, made me jump. My mind kept replaying the sound of that breathing, the way it had been so close, so deliberate. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever had been out there wasn't just some mindless creature. It was intelligent, it knew I was there, and it had been testing me. By the time I reached the trailhead and saw my car in the distance, relief washed over me like a flood. I practically sprinted the last stretch, throwing my gear into the trunk and jumping behind the wheel. My hands were still shaking as I fumbled with the keys. But once the engine roared to life, I felt a small sense of safety return. I drove down the mountain as fast as I could, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something massive and dark chasing me down the winding road. But there was nothing, just the quiet, empty forest fading into the distance behind me. When I finally made it back home, the unease still clung to me. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the shadow I'd seen, the tracks, the breathing. It all felt too real to be my imagination. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever had been out there wasn't just passing through, it was hunting, and I had been its prey. I haven't gone camping alone since. In fact, I haven't gone camping at all. Because no matter how much time passes, I can't forget that feeling, the way the forest had gone silent, the way the shadows seemed to shift around me, and the way something that shouldn't exist had been watching me. Even now, Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is still, I swear I can hear it again. That slow, deliberate, dragging sound just outside my window. And I wonder if it's found me again, waiting just beyond the trees. Story 8. Everyone said it was just a wolf. Even as I packed up my gear and headed out to investigate the livestock killings, that's what I kept hearing from the locals. It's a big wolf, probably a pack, they'd say, shaking their heads like it was obvious. And sure, I've seen wolves take down animals before, cows, deer, even the occasional horse if the pack was hungry enough. But this was different. The carnage was too extreme, too vicious. It felt wrong. I had been a park ranger for years, and I'd seen my fair share of wildlife attacks, but something about these reports got under my skin. The farmers on the edge of the park weren't just talking about missing sheep or cows. They were talking about torn-apart bodies, about shredded fences, and strange tracks that didn't quite match anything familiar. That's why I was out there, driving down a narrow dirt road into the thick of the forest, with nothing but my radio, a rifle, and my instincts. It wasn't supposed to be complicated. Find the wolf, take care of it if necessary, and make sure there wasn't anything else causing trouble. But the minute I parked the truck and stepped out into the evening air, something felt off. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the usual hum of insects. Just silence. I started down the trail, rifle slung over my shoulder and flashlight in hand. The sun was starting to set, casting long, twisted shadows through the trees. It felt like the forest was closing in around me, the silence pressing down harder with each step. I kept my eyes on the ground, looking for tracks, but there was nothing. Just the hard-packed dirt of the trail and the occasional scuff from an animal passing through. Then, about half an hour in, I saw it, a set of tracks that didn't belong. They started off like wolf prints, big, too big for a normal wolf, but still within the realm of possibility. But as I followed them, something changed. The tracks became deeper, wider, and then, this was the part that made my heart skip a beat. They shifted. The prints went from four-legged to two. I stopped cold, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. The transition was subtle, but unmistakable. The front paws had turned into something more like hands, clawed, massive hands, and the stride lengthened, like whatever had made these prints had stood up. A chill ran down my spine, and I reached for my rifle without even thinking. "Wolves don't walk on two legs," I muttered under my breath, trying to calm the rising tension in my chest. I told myself there had to be an explanation, maybe a bear with a messed-up paw, or something dragging itself through the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. This was something else. I kept moving, following the trail deeper into the woods as the last of the daylight slipped away. My flashlight cast long, narrow beams through the trees, but it only made everything feel more claustrophobic, like the shadows were alive and watching me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump, my senses on high alert. Then I found the clearing. It was a small, open space surrounded by thick trees and dense underbrush. The ground was torn up, the grass flattened and stained dark with blood. In the middle of the clearing was the body of a cow, or at least what was left of it. It had been ripped apart, shredded in a way that no wolf, no bear, nothing I knew of could do. The flesh had been gnawed at, chunks missing, and the bones, God, the bones were scattered like they'd been tossed aside in some kind of sick frenzy. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't just a predator looking for food. This was something more violent, more deliberate, and I wasn't alone out here. I stepped into the clearing, my eyes scanning the trees, rifle raised. The air was thick with the stench of blood and decay, but beneath it I caught something else, a foul, almost sulfuric smell that made my nose wrinkle. It was faint but distinct, like something rotting in the depths of the forest. Then, from the other side of the clearing, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the trees, too deep to be any wolf or bear. My blood ran cold as I slowly turned, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the shadows. But then I caught movement, something huge, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, hunched over, with broad shoulders and long, thick arms that almost scraped the ground. Its eyes glowed in the dark, a sickly yellow, locked onto me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The creature stepped closer, just enough for me to see it fully. It was covered in matted fur, but its face was wrong. It was a twisted, distorted version of a wolf's, but more human, with a long snout and sharp, jagged teeth. Its body was muscular, too muscular for a wolf, and it stood on two legs, its clawed hands flexing as if it was deciding whether or not to attack. For a split second, I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like my brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But there it was, standing in front of me, watching me with those glowing eyes. Then it snarled, a deep rumbling sound that snapped me out of my trance. I lifted the rifle and fired. The shot echoed through the forest, and for a second I thought I'd hit it. The creature recoiled, letting out a howl that sent a shiver down my spine. But it didn't go down. Instead, it lunged. I barely had time to dive out of the way, the thing's claws swiping through the air where I had just been standing. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my ears as I fired again and again. The bullet seemed to slow it down, but not enough. It moved too fast, too fluidly for something that big. 1 second it was on the other side of the clearing. The next it was right in front of me, its massive form blotting out everything else. I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran. My legs burned as I sprinted through the trees, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, snarling and growling like some nightmare brought to life. I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I needed to get the hell away from it. I stumbled over a fallen log, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot up my arm, but I forced myself back to my feet, glancing over my shoulder. It was still there, a dark shadow moving between the trees, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I ran harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail was up ahead. I just needed to make it to the truck. I could hear the thing getting closer, its growls growing louder, more frantic. Finally, I burst out onto the trail, the parking lot just a few yards ahead. I didn't slow down, not even as I fumbled with the keys and threw open the truck door. I slammed it shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, and for a brief moment, the thing standing at the edge of the forest. It watched me for a second, its eyes glowing in the light, before turning and disappearing back into the trees. I didn't wait around to see if it was coming back. I floored it, speeding down the narrow road, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I didn't stop until I was back in town, the lights of the buildings and the sound of cars finally breaking through the fog of fear that had wrapped around me. When I got back to the station, I filed my report. I wrote down the facts, the livestock killings, the strange tracks, the attack, but I left out the details, the thing I saw in the woods, the creature that walked like a man but hunted like a wolf. No one would believe me anyway. Story 9. The wind howled through the trees like it was alive, carrying with it a sound I couldn't place, a whisper, almost, a voice calling my name. I'd been out in the woods plenty of times before, but nothing ever felt like this. The deep, frozen silence of the forest was broken only by that eerie sound, sending chills through my body that had nothing to do with the cold. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving us with only the dim glow of our headlamps and the growing shadows around us. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My friend Mark was walking a few feet ahead of me, his breath visible in the crisp winter air. He turned, eyebrows furrowed. "Hear what?" he asked, glancing around. I hesitated. I thought I heard someone calling my name. Mark chuckled, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that came from amusement. It was the kind of laugh you use to brush off something you don't want to acknowledge. "You're probably just hearing the wind. It's picking up, and this place echoes weird." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right. But the voice, if it even was a voice, wasn't like the wind. It was too clear, too distinct. We were deep in the northern woods, in the middle of winter, tracking what we thought was a deer. It had been a last-minute hunting trip, a chance to get away from everything for a few days. Just me and Mark. We'd been best friends since high school, and hunting trips like this had become our tradition. But something about this particular trip didn't feel right from the start. The tracks we'd been following were strange. Too large for a deer, but too light to belong to a bear. The prints were wide, with long, almost claw-like indentations, and they weren't moving in any discernible pattern, like whatever we were tracking was wandering aimlessly. "Let's keep moving," Mark said, breaking the silence. "We're losing light, and I don't want to get stuck out here when the temperature drops anymore." I agreed, even though every step forward felt like a step deeper into something I didn't fully understand. The snow crunched under our boots, and the trees loomed taller, darker as we moved further into the woods. That's when I heard it again. My name, clearer this time. A woman's voice, soft and almost pleading. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Mark," I said, more urgently this time. "I'm serious. I just heard it again. Someone's calling my name." He turned, the annoyance gone from his face, replaced by concern. "No one's out here but us, man," he said, his voice lower now, almost as if he didn't want to admit something might be wrong. "This far into the woods? No way." But I wasn't convinced. The sound had been so close, like it was just beyond the trees. "Maybe someone's lost," I said, the logical part of my brain scrambling for an explanation. Or, I don't know, maybe it's an animal mimicking a voice. Mark glanced around, scanning the trees with the beam of his headlamp. We'd have seen someone by now, and animals don't do that. I felt a pit forming in my stomach. He was right. No one else was supposed to be out here, not this deep, and definitely not in this weather. But that didn't explain the voice, and the longer we stood there, the more I felt like something was watching us. I could feel it, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Mark took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Look, we've been out here for hours. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you. The cold can mess with your head. Let's keep going." I nodded reluctantly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. We pushed forward, the light from our headlamps barely piercing through the thickening darkness. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees and carrying with it that strange, low whistle. But now it wasn't just my name. It was Mark's, too. I heard it, clear as day, his name carried on the wind, almost like a whisper right next to me. "Mark," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer right away, but I saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand tightened around the rifle slung over his back. He'd heard it, too. We stood there, frozen, listening as the voice came again, soft, insistent, beckoning us deeper into the woods. "I don't like this," Mark muttered finally, glancing around. His breath was coming quicker now, visible in the cold night air. We should head back. But the voice came again, louder now, closer. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, like the very air around us had shifted, thickened. The woods no longer felt like the place I'd always known. They felt malevolent. We started to turn back, but the tracks, those strange, wandering tracks we'd been following, had changed. They weren't scattered anymore. They were deliberate, leading in a straight line deeper into the woods. And they were fresh, too fresh. "Those weren't there before," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's eyes were wide, darting between the trees, as if he expected to see something emerge from the shadows at any moment. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered. The wind howled again, but this time it wasn't a whistle or a call. It was a scream, long, drawn out, and inhuman. My stomach dropped as the sound echoed through the trees, reverberating off the trunks like it was bouncing in every direction. It was so loud, so impossibly loud, and it came from everywhere all at once. "We need to move," Mark said, his voice tight with panic. He started walking faster, but my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice, about how it had sounded so much like a person at first, how it had called my name like it knew me. We hadn't gone far when Mark suddenly stopped, his headlamp flickering over something on the ground. I followed his gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. There, half buried in the snow, was the carcass of a deer. But it wasn't just dead. It had been mutilated, torn apart by something with incredible strength. The flesh was shredded, the bones cracked and scattered, like whatever had done this hadn't been hunting for food. It had been hunting for sport. Mark backed away, his face pale. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But before I could respond, the scream came again, closer this time, louder, like it was right behind us. My body reacted before my mind did, and I started running. I could hear Mark behind me, his footsteps crunching in the snow as we tore through the trees, our breath ragged and panicked. The woods around us were a blur of shadows and movement, and that awful scream seemed to follow us, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know what was chasing us. We ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were going to explode, and still the scream didn't stop. It was relentless, an unnatural, bone-chilling sound that pierced through the very fabric of the night. Finally, we burst through the tree line, our truck just a few yards ahead. Mark reached it first, fumbling with the keys as I kept watch, my heart hammering in my chest. The scream was gone now, but the silence that followed was worse. It was thick, oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting. We scrambled into the truck, slamming the doors behind us. Mark floored the gas, and the tires spun for a moment before catching on the icy road. As we sped away, I glanced into the rearview mirror, my hands still shaking. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark figure, tall and hulking, standing just at the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. Neither of us said a word the entire drive back, but I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Whatever had been out there in the woods, whatever had called our names and screamed like something from a nightmare, it wasn't done with us, and I wasn't sure we'd ever be able to forget it. Story 10. The fog rolled in faster than we expected, swallowing the trees whole and turning the path ahead into a grey wall. What started as a lazy hike through the mountains quickly became something else, something unsettling. We'd been out in the wilderness for a few hours already, following a trail we found on an old map, far off the beaten path. Just me and my girlfriend, Sarah, hoping for a peaceful weekend away from everything. But when we stumbled upon that cabin, half hidden in the mist, the peace we'd been searching for felt like a distant memory. The cabin wasn't on the map. It just appeared, like it had been waiting for us, old and sagging in the dense fog. The wood was rotting, the windows cracked or broken, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. But with the fog getting worse, and the sun already disappearing behind the thick layer of clouds, we didn't have much of a choice. We needed to shelter for the night, and that cabin, creepy as it was the only option. "We should head back," Sarah said, her voice uneasy as she stared at the structure. Her blonde hair was already damp from the mist, clinging to her face. She didn't like this at all, I could tell, but heading back wasn't an option. The fog was too thick to navigate now, and the trail we'd followed had already disappeared in the whiteout. "We'll just stay the night," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's better than being stuck out here in this mess. We'll head out first thing in the morning." Sarah nodded reluctantly, though the way her eyes lingered on the cabin's broken windows told me she wasn't convinced. Neither was I, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to admit that the place gave me the same uneasy feeling. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the fog like a warning. Inside, the cabin was as run down as we expected. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mold. A few pieces of broken furniture were scattered around, the remnants of a table and some chairs, and a stone fireplace sat against the far wall. At least it was dry, I thought, though that didn't do much to calm the knot of anxiety growing in my chest. We set up our sleeping bags in the corner, near the fireplace, hoping that it would feel a little safer to have something solid at our backs. I got a small fire going with the wood we'd gathered earlier, and the flickering flames cast long shadows across the cabin's walls. The fog pressed up against the windows like something alive, making the darkness outside feel even more oppressive. As we settled in, Sarah kept glancing at the door, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I don't like it here," she whispered, barely audible over the crackling fire. "It feels wrong." I wanted to brush it off, tell her she was just tired and that the cabin was fine, but the truth was, I felt it too. There was something off about the place, like the air itself was thick with a kind of tension that I couldn't explain. I hadn't heard a single bird or animal since we found the cabin. The forest was dead silent, and the fog outside only made it worse. "I know," I said softly, scooting closer to her, "but we'll be fine. It's just one night. We'll leave at first light." She nodded again, though the worry didn't leave her eyes. We tried to sleep, but the quiet made it impossible to relax. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, made me sit up and listen, expecting to hear something, anything, out there in the fog. Sarah must have sensed it too, because she stayed curled up beside me, her breathing shallow, her eyes open. I don't know how long we lay there, but at some point I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something scratching at the cabin walls. My heart jolted in my chest, and I sat up, my ears straining in the thick silence. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only the faintest light across the room, but I could hear it, something moving just outside the cabin, slow and deliberate. I glanced over at Sarah. She was awake, her eyes wide and fearful. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat dry. "Stay here," I whispered back, grabbing the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag. I tried to ignore the way my hands shook as I clicked it on and slowly rose to my feet. The beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the room and landing on the door. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the scratching came again. Louder this time, like claws dragging across the wooden walls. I approached the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I reached for the handle. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, maybe an animal, lost in the fog. But something about the sound, the way it moved, made me doubt that. I pulled the door open a crack and shone the light outside. The fog was so thick I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me, just swirling white and the faint outline of trees beyond. But then I saw it, something moving just at the edge of the light. A figure, tall and hunched, almost blending in with the fog itself. My breath caught in my throat, and I slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. "What was it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But it's out there." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds outside. The scratching grew more frequent, moving around the cabin like something or someone was circling us, testing the walls. Every now and then, I'd catch glimpses of movement through the broken windows, but it was always fleeting, just a shadow in the fog. And then the whispering started. At first it was faint, barely audible over the crackling embers of the fire, but slowly it grew louder, more insistent. It was like a voice, but not a voice I could understand, just soft, murmuring sounds that sent chills crawling up my spine. It came from all around us, like the fog itself was speaking. Sarah's grip on my arm tightened, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go now." But I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my mind racing. Where would we go? The fog was so thick we'd never find our way back to the trail, and whatever was out there, it was waiting for us. The scratching stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was silent again. But that silence was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then came the knock. A single, slow knock on the door, so loud it seemed to rattle the walls of the cabin. We both jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. Another knock followed, then another, slow and deliberate, each one more deafening than the last. I stood, my legs trembling, and backed away from the door. I started, but I didn't know what to say. What was there to say? There was something outside, something that wasn't going to leave us alone. The knock came again, harder this time, and the door shook in its frame. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice tight with fear. "We're getting out of here." We scrambled to grab our things, not caring if we left something behind. The only thing that mattered was getting away from that cabin, away from whatever was outside. I threw the door open, the cold fog hitting us like a wall, and we plunged into the mist. The fog wrapped around us, thick and disorienting. The cabin disappeared behind us almost immediately, swallowed by the white. We ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we pushed forward blindly. But no matter how far we ran, that feeling of being watched didn't leave. The whispers followed us, growing louder in the fog, until I could barely hear my own thoughts over them. Finally, we broke through the trees, stumbling onto the main trail. The fog was still thick, but the trees were more spaced out here, and I could see the faint outline of the road ahead. We didn't stop running until we reached the truck. I never looked back. I didn't want to see if something had followed us. We drove out of those woods as fast as we could, and we never spoke of that night again. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that cabin, whatever was in the fog, it's still out there, waiting. Story 11. There's a moment, deep in the woods, when you realize just how alone you are. Not the kind of alone that feels peaceful or freeing, but the kind that makes your skin prickle and your heart pound a little faster. The kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up because you're suddenly acutely aware that no one would hear you scream. That's the kind of alone I felt the night we camped at Little Creek. We'd heard about the place from a friend, an isolated spot far off the usual trails, a place where no one ever goes. Me, Jason, and Emily figured it would be perfect. No other campers, no noisy hikers, just us and the stars. We wanted quiet, solitude, a real escape. We got exactly what we asked for. The first day was uneventful. We hiked most of the afternoon, reaching the spot just before sunset. The trees there were thicker than I expected, their branches knotted and twisted like they'd been growing that way for centuries. The creek was low, almost dry, the water barely a trickle over the rocks, and the air was still, so still that even our voices seemed muted, like the trees were swallowing every sound we made. But it was peaceful, in a way. We set up camp, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. The fire crackled softly, and the three of us sat around it, talking about nothing and everything. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or crack of a twig in the distance. And then, as the fire burned down to embers, we noticed it, the silence. It wasn't the natural quiet of the woods at night, the kind where you can still hear the insects and the wind in the trees. No, this was different. It was like everything had just stopped. No birds, no crickets, no breeze. Just dead, suffocating silence. Jason, always the first to make a joke when things felt tense, chuckled nervously. "Guess we scared off the wildlife." Emily frowned, her eyes flicking around the dark forest beyond the reach of the firelight. "I don't like it. It feels wrong." I didn't say anything, but she was right. There was something off about that silence. It pressed in on us, thick and heavy, making the night feel colder than it should have been. We decided to turn in for the night, figuring maybe a good night's sleep would make everything feel less weird, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I could hear something just beyond the campsite, something moving in the trees. But every time I sat up and listened, there was nothing, just that same eerie quiet. Around midnight, I heard a noise, soft, barely there, but definitely real. It was like whispering. I sat up, straining to hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat. It was coming from the direction of the trees, low and hushed, like a conversation just out of earshot. I thought maybe it was Jason or Emily, but when I glanced over, they were both sound asleep in their tents. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam into the woods. The trees looked taller, more menacing in the harsh light, their branches tangled together like skeletal arms. And then I saw them, the eyes. They were just past the edge of the light, glowing faintly in the darkness. They were too high up to be any animal I knew, but they weren't human either. The way they reflected back at me, unmoving, sent a chill through my entire body. I couldn't make out anything else, just those eyes, watching. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to call out, to wake Jason and Emily, but something held me back. It was like those eyes were daring me to make a sound, daring me to acknowledge them. I don't know how long I stared at them, but eventually the eyes blinked once, slowly, and then they were gone, just like that. The forest was dark again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Jason and Emily what I'd seen, but they didn't seem too concerned. Jason laughed it off, saying I probably just saw a deer or an owl. Emily was quiet, though. She didn't laugh. She just glanced at the trees, then back at me, her face pale. I could tell she believed me, even if she didn't want to admit it. We decided to stay another night, mostly because Jason insisted we were overreacting. We came all this way for some peace and quiet, he said. Let's not freak out over a pair of glowing eyes. But as the day went on, the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I wandered too far from camp, I felt it, like something was there, just out of sight, watching my every move. And the forest, still so unnervingly silent, only amplified the feeling. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the oppressive weight of the trees and that nagging sense of being followed. That night, the whispering started again, but louder this time. It wasn't just a faint murmur. It was clear, like voices, too many voices, speaking all at once in some language I couldn't understand. It was all around us, coming from the trees, from the dark. I sat up in my tent, my heart racing, listening as the voices swirled closer and closer. Then the scratching started. It was soft at first, like something dragging its claws across the bark of a tree, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside my tent. My blood ran cold as I heard it scrape along the fabric, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. Jason, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Emily. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam trembling as I pointed it at the tent's zipper. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for it, my hand shaking. I had to see. I had to know what was out there. I unzipped the tent slowly, inch by inch, until the cold night air hit my face. I shone the light outside. The ground was covered in footprints, not animal tracks, not human prints, something else entirely. They were large, too large, and the shape of them was all wrong. Long, clawed toes, deeply pressed into the dirt, like something heavy had been walking around our camp. And they circled the tents. I heard a rustling behind me, and I whipped the flashlight around just in time to catch a glimpse of something tall and hunched, disappearing into the trees. My heart leaped into my throat, and I scrambled out of the tent, stumbling over my sleeping bag as I rushed to Jason's. "Jason! Emily! Wake up!" I shouted, panic clawing at my chest. They woke up groggy and confused, but the moment they saw my face, they knew something was wrong. I pointed to the tracks, my voice shaking as I tried to explain. Jason's face went pale, and even he didn't have a joke for this. Emily looked like she was about to cry. "We're leaving," Jason said, his voice tight. "Right now." We packed up as quickly as we could, the whispering growing louder, more frenzied as we fumbled with our gear. The scratching came again, this time from the trees, from the branches above us. I didn't dare look up. As we started down the trail, the fog rolled in, thick, suffocating. It swallowed everything. I could barely see a few feet ahead, the trees becoming ghostly shapes in the mist. But worse than the fog was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that we weren't alone, that whatever had been watching us was following. Close, too close. The whispering didn't stop. It grew louder with every step, until it felt like it was right in my ear. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those eyes again, those awful glowing eyes watching from the fog. But I didn't. I saw something worse. Just ahead, through the thick haze of the fog, I saw a figure standing on the trail. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long, its face hidden in shadow, but I knew it was watching us. I could feel its gaze burning into me. We ran. I didn't even have to say anything. Jason's Emily and I just bolted, tearing through the fog, the whispers and scratching growing louder and more frantic behind us. The figure never moved. It just stood there, watching as we ran for our lives. We didn't stop running until we were back at the car, breathless and shaking. We didn't look back. We never went back to Little Creek. I still hear the whispers sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. And I still see those glowing eyes in my dreams, watching, waiting. Story 12. The howl that shattered the stillness of the forest wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was too deep, too guttural to belong to a wolf, and it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the crisp mountain air. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone on this trail, and whatever was out there wasn't something I was prepared to face. My name's Sarah, and I've been an avid hiker for as long as I can remember. The Appalachian Trail has always been my holy grail, and this solo trek was supposed to be the culmination of years of dreaming and months of planning. I'd set out 3 days ago, my pack laden with supplies and my heart full of excitement. The first 2 days had been everything I'd hoped for: challenging climbs, breathtaking views, and the soul-soothing solitude of the wilderness. But as I made my way along a particularly remote stretch of trail on that 3rd day, something felt off. The birds had gone quiet, and the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush was conspicuously absent. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the natural ebb and flow of the forest. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I paused to take a drink from my water bottle and scan my surroundings. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement on the ridge above me. I squinted, trying to make out what it could be. A bear, maybe. But as I watched, a figure rose up on 2 legs, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a canine-like head perched atop broad shoulders. For a moment, our eyes met across the distance, and I felt a jolt of primal fear course through me. This was no bear. I blinked, and it was gone. Part of me wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that the solitude and the long days of hiking had played tricks on my mind, but I knew what I'd seen, even if I couldn't explain it. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to reach the next campsite before darkness fell. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of paranoia and backward glances. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold lurking menace. By the time I reached the small clearing where I planned to make camp, my nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I went through the motions of setting up my tent and preparing a meager dinner, all the while fighting the urge to abandon my gear and run. As twilight deepened into true night, that bone-chilling howl split the air again, closer this time. I zipped myself into my tent, knowing full well how little protection the thin fabric offered. Sleep was out of the question. I lay there, every muscle tense, straining my ears for any sound of approach. It started as a faint rustle, so quiet I almost missed it over the pounding of my own heart. Then came the unmistakable crunch of leaves under a heavy footfall. Something was circling my tent. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was knew I was aware of its presence and was savoring my fear. I held my breath, willing myself to be as still and quiet as possible. The footsteps paused near the entrance of my tent. I could hear deep, ragged breathing, so close it seemed to fill the small space. A low growl rumbled through the air, a sound that vibrated in my chest and sent fresh waves of terror coursing through me. For what felt like hours, I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, certain that at any moment claws would tear through the tent and I'd come face to face with the creature. But eventually the footsteps receded, moving off into the surrounding forest. I didn't sleep a wink that night. My hand clutched around the small canister of bear spray that I knew would be woefully inadequate against whatever was out there. As the first grey light of dawn seeped through the tent fabric, I cautiously unzipped the entrance and peered out. The clearing looked peaceful enough, dew-covered and quiet in the early morning stillness. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that the night's terrors had been nothing more than an extraordinarily vivid nightmare. Then I saw the tracks. They circled my tent, just as I'd heard them do in the night, but these were no ordinary animal prints. They were massive, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of sharp claws at the end of each toe. They looked almost like wolf tracks, but disturbingly elongated, as if made by something that walked on 2 legs rather than 4. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone and snapped a few pictures of the prints. I needed proof, needed to know I wasn't going crazy. As I followed the trail of tracks with my eyes, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Several of the trees at the edge of the clearing bore deep claw marks, gouged into the bark at a height that would be over my head. I packed up camp in record time. My earlier plan of a leisurely morning hike forgotten in my desperation to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. As I shouldered my pack and took one last look around the clearing, movement at the tree line caught my eye. For a split second, I saw it again. That massive, wolf-like head, those eerily intelligent eyes fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. Then it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. But I knew it wasn't leaving. It was following. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, fear, and increasingly erratic behavior on my part. I abandoned my carefully planned itinerary, pushing myself to hike farther and faster each day. I skipped designated campsites, choosing instead to pitch my tent in hidden, defensible spots off the main trail. I barely slept, jolting awake at every sound, real or imagined. But no matter how far or fast I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, being hunted. Each morning, I'd find those massive tracks around my campsite. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of a large, shadowy figure moving through the trees parallel to the trail. Once, I heard that soul-shattering howl so close behind me that I broke into a run, not stopping until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. I started talking to myself, trying to ward off the creeping madness that threatened to overwhelm me. "It's not real," I'd mutter as I stumbled along the trail. "Dogmen don't exist. You're just tired and scared and imagining things." But the rational part of my brain was fighting a losing battle against the primal fear that had taken hold. On the 5th day since that first sighting, I reached a trail junction where I knew there was a ranger station. The thought of seeing another human being, of being able to tell someone what was happening, spurred me on, despite my exhaustion. As I approached the small cabin, I felt a wild hope surge through me. Safety was just yards away. That's when I heard it, that familiar, dread-inducing growl, closer than ever before. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature that had been haunting my every waking moment. In the full light of day, I could finally see it clearly, and the reality was more terrifying than anything I had imagined. It stood easily 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish fusion of human and wolf. Thick, matted fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands ended in wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that would stay with me forever, unmistakably canine, with a long snout filled with gleaming fangs, yet with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence, an almost human awareness. For a long moment, we stared at each other, predator and prey locked in a frozen tableau. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it lunged toward me. I turned and ran, screaming, toward the ranger station. I could hear it behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck as I reached for the door handle. The next thing I knew, I was babbling my story to a very confused and concerned park ranger. A search of the area around the station revealed no sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing to corroborate my wild tale. The pictures I'd taken of the tracks days earlier had somehow vanished from my phone. I know how it sounds. Believe me, there are days when I manage to convince myself that it was all in my head, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many days alone in the wilderness. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that unearthly howl ringing in my ears. And I know, with a bone-deep certainty, that what I encountered out there was real. I don't hike alone anymore. Hell, I barely go into my own backyard after dark, because I know it's out there, watching, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day our paths will cross again. Only next time, I might not be lucky enough to escape. Story 13. The first knock could have been anything. A falling branch, a woodpecker, the forest settling. But the second knock, a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the trees, sent a chill down my spine. In all my years as a wildlife photographer, I'd never heard anything quite like it. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone in these woods, and whatever was out there was far from ordinary. My name's Jake, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades capturing images of North America's most elusive creatures. From wolverines in the Rockies to Florida panthers in the Everglades, I've had my share of close encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to experience in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I'd come to this remote corner of Oregon chasing rumors of unusually large tracks and strange sightings reported by locals. While I didn't put much stock in Bigfoot stories, I knew that even the wildest tales often had a kernel of truth. Maybe there was an undiscovered species of bear in these woods, or a particularly bold cougar. Whatever it was, I was determined to get it on camera. The first few days were uneventful. I set up my base camp in a small clearing, rigged a few remote cameras along game trails, and spent hours in my blind, watching and waiting. The forest was beautiful, all towering pines and moss-draped firs, but it was also unnervingly quiet. There was a stillness to the place that felt almost unnatural, as if the usual buzz of wildlife was being suppressed by some unseen presence. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn for the strange. I was in my tent, reviewing the day's footage on my laptop, when I heard that first knock. I paused, cocking my head to listen. A few minutes later, there it was again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from something much larger than any woodpecker. Curiosity overcame caution, and I unzipped my tent, peering out into the moonlit clearing. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape moving between the trees at the edge of my camp. My heart raced as I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture whatever it was before it disappeared. I managed to snap a few shots before the figure melted back into the shadows. Hands shaking, I pulled up the images on my camera's screen. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, partially obscured by branches but unmistakable, was a face. It was undeniably ape-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected the camera's flash, but there was something disturbingly human in its expression. This was no bear. Sleep was out of the question after that. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my tent, jumping at every sound, my mind racing with possibilities. Had I actually photographed a Sasquatch? The rational part of my brain rebelled against the idea, but I couldn't deny what I'd seen. As dawn broke, I cautiously emerged from my tent, half expecting to find my camp ransacked, but everything was exactly as I'd left it, almost. There, pressed into a patch of soft earth near my tent, was a footprint. It was huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with 5 distinct toes. I carefully photographed and measured it, my hands trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. The next few days passed in a blur of hypervigilance and adrenaline. I was constantly on edge, my camera at the ready, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush. I heard the knocking several more times, always at night, always seeming to come from different directions. Sometimes it was answered by a similar knock from farther away, as if the creatures, and I was now certain there was more than one, were communicating. I began to find other signs as well. Branches twisted and broken in ways that no known animal could manage. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on bark. Once, I found an entire sapling uprooted and laid across a game trail, as if to block the path. But it was the feeling of being watched that really got to me. Even when I couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary, I had the constant prickling sensation of eyes on me. It was as if the entire forest had become a stage, and I was performing for an unseen audience. On the 7th night, things escalated. I was awakened in the early hours of the morning by the sound of heavy breathing just outside my tent. It was deep and rhythmic. Not quite human, but definitely not belonging to any animal I was familiar with. I lay there, every muscle tense, barely daring to breathe. Then, slowly, a shadow fell across the tent wall. Something massive was standing just on the other side of the thin fabric. I could see the vague outline of a huge, humanoid shape as it leaned in close, sniffing audibly. I was certain that at any moment, powerful hands would tear through the tent and I'd find myself face to face with the creature. But after what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved away. I heard heavy footsteps retreating into the forest, accompanied by a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was only then that I realized I'd been holding my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. When morning came, I found my campsite in disarray. My cooler had been opened, its contents strewn about. One of my remote cameras had been torn from its mounting and smashed against a tree. And there, right in the center of the clearing, was a message spelled out in broken branches. Go home. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that my commitment to documenting this incredible discovery outweighed my fear. But the truth is, I've never packed up camp so quickly in my life. As I hurried down the trail toward my car, I could have sworn I heard low, guttural chuckling from the woods around me. It wasn't until I was safely back in civilization, my hands wrapped around a hot cup of coffee in a small-town diner, that I finally allowed myself to really process what had happened. With shaking hands, I pulled out my camera and began to review the images I'd captured. Most were frustratingly inconclusive, blurry shapes in the darkness, partial footprints, broken branches. But then I came to the shot from that first night, the one that had started it all. I zoomed in on the face peering out from between the trees and felt a jolt of both terror and awe. The eyes were what struck me most. They weren't the blank, animal stare I was used to seeing in my wildlife photographs. There was intelligence there, curiosity, and something else I couldn't quite define. It was as if I was looking at a being that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but something in between. I sat there for a long time, staring at that face on my camera screen, grappling with the implications of what I'd experienced. Part of me wanted to shout it from the rooftops, to show the world the proof I'd obtained of a creature long dismissed as myth. But another part of me, the part that had felt the weight of that intelligent gaze, hesitated. These beings, whatever they were, had clearly gone to great lengths to avoid human contact. They had the power to easily harm me, but had chosen not to, instead sending a clear message that they wanted to be left alone. Did I have the right to expose their existence to a world that would undoubtedly seek to study, exploit, or even hunt them? In the end, I made a decision that would likely baffle my colleagues and disappoint cryptid enthusiasts around the world. I deleted the photos, all of them, the footprint measurements, the hair samples I'd collected, the journal where I'd documented my observations. I destroyed it all. Some might call it professional suicide, throwing away what could have been the wildlife discovery of the century, but I like to think of it as honoring a request. Those creatures had allowed me a glimpse into their world, had revealed themselves to me in a way they likely had to few others. The least I could do was respect their privacy. I still go into the woods, still take my cameras and wait patiently in blinds for that perfect shot. But now, when I'm deep in the wilderness and I feel that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched, I don't reach for my camera. Instead, I pack up my gear and move on, leaving only footprints behind, because I know they're out there, these beings that blur the line between legend and reality. And I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved, some secrets better left untold. After all, isn't the possibility of wonder more valuable than cold, hard proof? Story 14. The moment I realized we were trapped, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The blizzard howled outside, but it wasn't the storm that sent chills down my spine. It was the deep, guttural growl coming from the cabin's attic, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew. We'd sought shelter from one danger, only to stumble into something far worse. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid backcountry skier for years. This trip was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway with my 3 closest friends, Jess, Mike, and Sarah. We'd planned this excursion for months, excited to explore a remote area of the Cascade Mountains, known for its pristine powder and challenging terrain. The first day had been perfect. Blue skies, fresh snow, and the exhilarating rush of carving our way down untouched slopes. We'd laughed, raced each other, and marveled at the breathtaking views. As the sun began to set, we made our way to the small cabin we'd rented for the night, our cheeks flushed with cold and excitement. Looking back, I should have noticed the signs, the unusual quiet in the forest, the lack of animal tracks in the snow. But I was too caught up in the thrill of the day to pay attention to the unease creeping at the edges of my consciousness. We were about half a mile from the cabin when the weather turned. It started with a few lazy snowflakes, but within minutes we found ourselves in the midst of a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled, driving snow into our faces and obscuring the trail. We pushed on, knowing we had to reach shelter before nightfall. When we finally stumbled upon the cabin, it looked like salvation. A solid structure of rough-hewn logs, it promised warmth and safety from the storm. We hurried inside, slamming the door against the wind. As we shook off the snow and got our bearings, Jess was the first to notice something was off. "Guys," she said, her voice tight, "look at this." She was pointing at the cabin wall, where deep gouges marred the wood. They looked like claw marks, but they were far too large to belong to any bear or mountain lion. Mike laughed nervously. "Probably just some kids messing around," he said, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We tried to shake off our unease, busying ourselves with starting a fire and unpacking our gear. But as we moved through the small space, more unsettling details came to light. A musty, acrid smell permeated the air, reminiscent of wet dog, but much stronger. In one corner, we found a pile of gnawed bones, some of which looked disturbingly large and fresh. Sarah, always the practical one, suggested we leave and try to make it back to our car. But one look out the window killed that idea. The blizzard had intensified, turning the world outside into a swirling white void. We were stuck here, at least for the night. As darkness fell, the temperature in the cabin dropped despite the fire. We huddled together, sharing stories and trying to keep our spirits up, but every creak of the roof, every howl of the wind had us jumping. We were all on edge, though no one wanted to admit why. It was just past midnight when we heard it, a heavy thud from the roof, followed by the sound of something large moving across the shingles. We fell silent, eyes wide, straining to listen. There was a pause, then a scratching noise, as if massive claws were raking across the wood. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Before anyone could answer, a low, rumbling growl filled the air. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably menacing. Whatever was up there, it wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. It was something else entirely. For hours, we sat frozen in terror as the thing on the roof moved back and forth. Occasionally, it would let out another of those bone-chilling growls, or we'd hear the snap of wood as if it was testing the strength of the roof. None of us slept. We barely breathed. As the first grey light of dawn seeped through the windows, the noises finally stopped. We waited, listening intently, but the only sound was the continuing howl of the wind. Slowly, cautiously, we began to move. "We need to get out of here," Jess said, her voice hoarse from fear and lack of sleep. No one argued. We packed up as quickly and quietly as we could, all of us jumping at every sound. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, scratched into the floorboards near where I'd been sitting, was a crude symbol, a stick figure with an elongated head, surrounded by what looked like flames. I didn't point it out to the others. They were scared enough already. The storm had died down overnight, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Under normal circumstances, it would have been breathtakingly beautiful, but as we stepped outside, scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement, it felt more like a vast, empty trap. We had just strapped on our skis when Sarah let out a strangled gasp. "Look," she said, pointing to the roof of the cabin. My heart nearly stopped. The snow-covered roof was crisscrossed with deep furrows, as if something with massive claws had been pacing back and forth all night. At the edge of the roof, the gutter had been torn away, leaving a gaping hole into the attic. "Go!" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Go now!" We set off down the slope, our movements clumsy with fear. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see some monstrous shape emerge from the cabin and give chase. But the landscape remained empty and still. We'd made it about a quarter-mile when Mike suddenly stopped, causing Jess to crash into him. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his nostrils flaring. I took a deep breath and immediately wished I hadn't. The air was filled with that same musty, acrid scent we'd noticed in the cabin, only stronger. Much stronger. "It's close," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. That's when we heard it, the crunch of snow under heavy footfalls, coming from the trees to our left. We turned as one, and I felt my heart stutter in my chest. There, half hidden behind a massive pine, was a shape that defied explanation. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a nightmarish blend of human and wolf. Thick matted fur covered its muscular frame, and its hands, if you could call them that, ended in long, curved claws. But it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. A long, canine snout filled with gleaming fangs, topped by eyes that burned with an unsettling intelligence. For a long moment we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff with the creature. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it began to move toward us. "Run!" I screamed, and we took off down the slope. What followed was the most terrifying ski run of my life. We flew down the mountain, carving sharp turns around trees and leaping over fallen logs. I could hear the creature crashing through the forest behind us, its growls growing louder as it gained ground. We burst out of the tree line onto a wide, open slope. In the distance, I could see the small cluster of buildings that marked the ski resort where we'd left our car. We were almost there. That's when I heard Sarah scream. I looked back to see her sprawled in the snow, her ski caught on a hidden branch. The creature was bearing down on her, covering the distance between them with impossible speed. I didn't think, I just acted. I turned my skis, angling back up the slope toward Sarah. I could hear Mike and Jess yelling at me to stop, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. As I neared Sarah, I could see the terror in her eyes, could smell the rank odor of the creature as it closed in. At the last possible second, I reached down and grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her to her feet. The momentum carried us forward, just as the creature's claws slashed through the air where she had been. We rocketed down the slope, the beast hot on our heels. I could hear its labored breathing, feel the heat of its presence at our backs. But with every yard, the resort grew closer, just a little farther. We hit the parking lot at full speed, our skis scraping on the asphalt as we made a beeline for my SUV. Mike already had the engine running. We threw ourselves into the vehicle, and I stomped on the gas before the doors were even fully closed. As we peeled out of the lot, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror of a massive, fur-covered shape standing at the edge of the trees. Then we were around a bend, and it was gone. We drove in stunned silence for a long time, each lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we hit the main highway that Jess finally spoke. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice shaking. I shook my head, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. "I don't know," I said, "and I don't think I want to know." We made a pact that day to never speak of what happened to anyone else. Who would believe us, anyway? But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the mountains. And I wonder if, somewhere in those remote forests, something ancient and terrible still roams, waiting for unwary travelers to seek shelter from the storm. Story 15. The shredded backpack was the first sign that this wasn't going to be a typical search and rescue operation. As I knelt to examine the tattered fabric, my stomach churned at the sight of the enormous, jagged teeth marks puncturing the material. Whatever had done this wasn't just big, it was monstrous. And somewhere in these dark woods, it was hunting. My name is Ranger Jack Cooper, and I've been with search and rescue in the Cascades for over a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange things out here in the wilderness, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that night. It all started with a routine missing person report. A solo hiker, David Chen, hadn't checked in with his family for 3 days. Not uncommon in areas with spotty cell service, but his worried sister had called it in. My team, myself, Lisa, our expert tracker, and Mike, our medic, headed out at first light to David's last known location. The day started normally enough. We followed the main trail, calling David's name and listening for any response. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird call or rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But as we pushed deeper into the backcountry, an unsettling silence began to settle over the woods. Lisa was the first to notice. "Jack," she said, her voice low, "something's not right. There should be more wildlife activity than this." I nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She was right. The forest felt empty, as if all the animals had fled. We pressed on, the unease growing with each step. That's when we found the backpack, torn to shreds and partially hidden beneath a fallen log. The damage was unlike anything I'd seen before. Bear attacks leave distinctive claw marks, but this looked like something had tried to eat the bag itself. Mike examined the bite marks, his face pale. "These punctures are huge," he muttered. "Whatever did this has a jaw strength that's off the charts." As Lisa catalogued the scene, I radioed back to base. "We've found evidence of the missing hiker," I reported. "Possible animal attack, requesting additional support and animal control." The response came back garbled, full of static. All I could make out was, "Storm coming. Radio silence. Be careful." Then the line went dead. Great. We were on our own. We decided to set up a base camp and conduct a grid search of the surrounding area. As the day wore on, we found more disturbing signs. deep claw marks gouged into tree trunks, far higher than a bear could reach, massive tracks in the soft earth that didn't match any known predator, and most chilling of all, smears of what looked like blood on the rocks near a small stream. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped rapidly. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain. We huddled around our small camp stove, each lost in our own thoughts. "We should head back in the morning," Mike said, breaking the uneasy silence. "Whatever's out there, we're not equipped to handle it." Lisa nodded in agreement, but I hesitated. "We can't just abandon the search," I argued. "David could still be out there, injured and waiting for help." Before anyone could respond, a bone-chilling shriek echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, not quite animal, not quite human, but filled with a primal rage that made my blood run cold. We were on our feet in an instant, flashlights scanning the darkness beyond our small circle of light. The forest had gone deathly quiet, as if holding its breath. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat as my flashlight beam caught a pair of glowing eyes in the underbrush. They were huge, set high off the ground, and filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a speed that defied its apparent size, the creature burst from the shadows. In the chaos that followed, I caught only glimpses of our attacker. Matted fur, elongated limbs that seemed to blend aspects of bear and wolf, a face that was a nightmare fusion of human and animal features, and those eyes, burning with a hunger that was all too familiar. We scattered, years of training kicking in despite our terror. I heard Mike yell something about getting to higher ground, saw Lisa sprinting toward a large boulder. I ran, my heart pounding in my ears, acutely aware of the heavy footfalls behind me. I don't know how long I fled through the darkened forest. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins kept me moving, driven by the primal need to escape. Eventually, I found myself at the base of a steep cliff. With no other options, I began to climb, my fingers scrabbling for purchase on the rough stone. About halfway up, I wedged myself into a narrow crevice, trying to catch my breath and take stock of the situation. The creature's howls echoed through the night, sometimes near, sometimes far. It was hunting us, I realized with a chill, toying with us like a cat with a mouse. As the hours crawled by, the storm hit in full force. Rain lashed against the cliff face, and lightning illuminated the forest below in brief, terrifying flashes. In one of these moments of illumination, I caught sight of something that made my heart stop. There, at the base of the cliff, was the creature. It was looking directly at me, its lips pulled back in a snarl that revealed rows of dagger-like teeth, but it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They held an almost human intelligence, a calculating cruelty that spoke of something far more than a simple predator. I pressed myself further into the crevice, praying that the creature couldn't climb. As if in answer to my thoughts, it began to scale the cliff face with horrifying ease, its claws finding purchase where human hands would struggle. In that moment, facing what I was certain would be my death, a strange calm came over me. If this was how it ended, I would meet it head-on. I unholstered my sidearm, knowing it would likely do little against this monster, but determined to go down fighting. Just as the creature reached my level, a piercing whistle cut through the storm. The beast's head snapped around, its attention drawn to something in the forest below. After a moment of hesitation that felt like an eternity, it let out a frustrated growl and descended, disappearing into the trees with uncanny speed. I remained frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe for what felt like hours. As the first light of dawn began to penetrate the cloud cover, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. "Jack, Jack, are you out there?" It was Lisa. I've never been so happy to hear another person's voice in my life. Slowly, carefully, I made my way down the cliff. Lisa was there waiting, her face a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Mike appeared a few moments later, limping but alive. As we made our way back to civilization, we shared our experiences in hushed tones. Each of us had seen the creature, had barely escaped its clutches, and each of us knew that what we'd encountered defied logical explanation. The official report would state that we'd had a run-in with an unusually aggressive bear, possibly rabid. David Chen's disappearance would be chalked up to a tragic hiking accident. But we knew the truth. In the years since that night, I've done extensive research. I've spoken with cryptozoologists, folklorists, and indigenous elders. I've pored over old legends and recent sightings, and I've come to a chilling conclusion. What we encountered that night was something ancient, something that has been living in the shadows of human civilization for centuries. Some call it a Wendigo, others a skinwalker. But no name can fully capture the terror of that night. I still work search and rescue, still venture into those same woods. But now, when I hear an unexplained sound in the forest or catch a glimpse of movement just at the edge of my vision, I don't dismiss it. I know what's out there waiting in the darkness, and I know that someday our paths may cross again. Only next time, I'll be ready. Story 16. The moment I saw those glowing red eyes peering out from the cave, I knew we were in trouble. Dangling from our climbing ropes halfway up a sheer cliff face, with night falling fast and a storm brewing on the horizon, we were sitting ducks. Whatever was watching us from that dark opening wasn't just curious, it was hungry. My name's Mia, and I've been rock climbing for the better part of a decade. My climbing partner, Jake and I, had tackled some of the most challenging routes across the country, but nothing could have prepared us for what we encountered on that remote cliff in the Rockies. The day had started like any other climbing expedition. We'd set out at dawn, our packs loaded with gear, spirits high as we approached the imposing rock face we'd been planning to conquer for months. The first few hours of the climb were exhilarating. The rock was solid, the holds challenging but manageable, and the view as we ascended was breathtaking. We were about halfway up when things started to go wrong. The weather, which had been clear and calm all morning, began to shift. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, and a cold wind picked up, whistling around the rocky outcroppings. "Maybe we should call it," Jake shouted over the rising wind. "That storm looks nasty." I was tempted to agree, but we'd come so far. "Let's push on to that ledge," I called back, pointing to a wide shelf about 100 feet above us. "We can reassess from there." Jake nodded, and we continued our ascent. The wind grew stronger with every foot we climbed, and I could hear the distant rumble of thunder. By the time we reached the ledge, the first fat droplets of rain were beginning to fall. "No way we're making it to the top before this hits," Jake said, shaking his head as he secured his harness to a sturdy outcropping. "We need to find shelter and wait it out." I scanned our surroundings, my heart sinking as I realized how exposed we were. Then I spotted it, a dark opening in the cliff face, about 50 feet to our left. "There," I said, pointing, "looks like a cave." "It's our best bet." We traversed carefully along the narrow ledge, the wind tugging at our clothes and gear. As we neared the cave entrance, an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something about the opening seemed off. It was too perfectly shaped, too dark. "I don't like this," Jake muttered as we peered into the inky blackness. Before I could respond, a deafening crack of thunder split the air. The storm was upon us in full force now, rain lashing against the cliff face and reducing visibility to near zero. "We don't have a choice," I shouted over the deluge. "Come on!" We ducked into the cave just as a bolt of lightning illuminated the world outside. In that brief flash, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold, a massive, hair-covered figure silhouetted against the cave wall. Jake saw it too. We stumbled backward, fumbling for our headlamps. As the beams cut through the darkness, my worst fears were confirmed. The cave wasn't empty. There, not 20 feet away, stood a creature that defied explanation. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow, a flattened nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Deep-set and glowing, with an eerie red light, they fixed on us with an intelligence that was undeniably predatory. For a long moment, we stood frozen, locked in a silent standoff with the beast. Then, with a speed that belied its massive size, it lunged toward us. We scrambled out of the cave, our training forgotten in the face of blind panic. The storm raged around us as we clipped into our ropes and began a frenzied descent. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing behind us, punctuated by guttural grunts that sent chills down my spine. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake yelled as we rappelled down the cliff face. "I don't know," I shouted back, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Just keep moving." We descended as fast as we dared, the rain-slicked rock making every movement treacherous. I kept glancing up, expecting to see the creature following us down the cliff, but the darkness above remained empty, at least as far as I could see through the storm. We were about 100 feet from the ground when disaster struck. A bolt of lightning hit the cliff face above us, sending a shower of rocks cascading down. I heard Jake cry out, and then his rope went slack. "Jake!" I screamed, swinging over to where he dangled limply from his harness. He was unconscious, a nasty gash on his forehead bleeding freely. I managed to secure him to my own rope, but now I faced an impossible choice. I couldn't safely lower both of us with the storm raging and Jake out cold. But staying put meant certain death, if not from exposure, then from the creature that I was sure was still hunting us. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very rock itself. I looked up, my headlamp cutting through the rain, and my heart nearly stopped. There, crawling down the cliff face with inhuman agility, was the beast from the cave. In that moment, facing what I was certain would be our doom, a strange calm came over me. If this was how it ended, I wouldn't go down without a fight. I unclipped the ice axe from my harness, gripping it tightly as I watched the creature's descent. It reached us with terrifying speed, those glowing red eyes fixed on Jake's limp form. As it extended a massive, clawed hand toward my partner, I swung the ice axe with all my strength. The creature roared in pain and rage as the axe bit into its arm. It swatted at me, and I felt a searing pain across my shoulder as its claws tore through my jacket and into flesh. The force of the blow sent me swinging wildly on my rope, and I nearly lost my grip on Jake. What followed was the most harrowing few minutes of my life. Dangling precariously from the cliff, I fought a desperate battle against a being that shouldn't exist. Every swing of my axe was met with a counterattack that threatened to send us plummeting to our deaths. The storm raged around us, lightning illuminating the scene in strobing flashes that made the whole encounter seem like some surreal nightmare. Just when I thought my strength would give out, a miraculous thing happened. A particularly bright flash of lightning lit up the cliff face, and the creature recoiled, letting out a shriek of pain. It shielded its eyes, momentarily blinded. In that instant of vulnerability, I saw my chance. I swung the ice axe one last time, catching the beast squarely in the chest. It lost its grip on the rock face and fell, its roar of rage fading as it plummeted into the darkness below. I hung there for a long moment, gasping for breath, barely able to believe what had just happened. Then Jake stirred, groaning softly, and I was jolted back to reality. We still had to get down this cliff. The rest of the descent was a blur of pain, exhaustion, and fear. Every shadow seemed to hold another monster, every sound the return of our attacker. But finally, mercifully, our feet touched solid ground. We stumbled back to our camp in a daze, the storm gradually dying down around us. As I patched up Jake's head wound and my own shoulder, we tried to process what we'd encountered. "What was that thing, Mia?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, wincing at the movement. "I don't know. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? Some kind of, I don't know, mountain monster? It doesn't seem possible." but we both knew what we'd seen, what we'd fought. In the years since that night, I've done a lot of research. I've read about cryptid sightings in the area, about indigenous legends of giant, hair-covered beasts that stalk the mountains. I've even reached out to some cryptozoologists, sharing our story under the condition of anonymity. Some nights, when the wind howls outside my window, I find myself back on that cliff face, staring into those glowing red eyes. I've continued climbing. You can't let fear rule your life after all. But I'm more cautious now, more aware of the shadows, of the unknown creatures that might be watching from dark caves and deep forests. Because I know the truth now. The monsters of legend aren't just stories. They're real. They're out there, and they're watching. And sometimes, on lonely mountain peaks and in deep, dark woods, they do more than just watch. So the next time you're in the wilderness and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being observed by unseen eyes, trust your instincts. You're not alone out there, and not everything watching you from the shadows is as harmless as we'd like to believe. Story 17. The first tree I saw bent into an impossible arch made me question my sanity. The second one, twisted into a perfect spiral, made me question reality. By the time I stumbled into the clearing filled with trees contorted into shapes that defied the laws of nature, I knew I had wandered into something far beyond my understanding. And when I heard that low, rumbling growl from the underbrush, I realized I wasn't alone. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been a forest ranger in the Pacific Northwest for over a decade. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in that remote corner of the forest. It all started with a routine patrol. We'd been getting reports of unusual tree damage and strange tracks in an area that didn't see much human traffic. My supervisor asked me to check it out, thinking it might be some kids messing around or maybe a bear with some weird habits. I packed my gear, radioed in my route, and headed out at first light. The hike started normally enough. The forest was quiet in the early morning, dew still clinging to the ferns and moss that carpeted the forest floor. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling that familiar sense of peace that always came over me when I was deep in the woods. But as I pushed further into the backcountry, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. A fallen log that looked like it had been snapped like a twig, claw marks on trees that were far too high for any bear to reach. And then there was the silence. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. That's when I saw the first bent tree. It was a massive Douglas fir. Its trunk curved into a perfect arch, like some giant hand had bent it over. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no way this could be natural, and no human could have done this either. As I continued along the trail, I found more trees twisted into impossible shapes. Some were coiled like springs, others tied into knots that would make a sailor weep. It was beautiful in a terrifying, otherworldly way. Finally, I emerged into a large clearing that took my breath away. Dozens of trees surrounded the space, each one contorted into a unique, impossible form. It was like stumbling into some surreal art installation or alien landscape. In the center of the clearing was a perfect circle of bare earth, the ground smooth as if it had been swept clean. I approached the circle cautiously, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. As I neared the edge, I noticed strange markings in the dirt. They looked almost like footprints, but they were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, and had an unusual, almost human-like shape. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, searching for the source of the sound. The forest had gone deathly quiet, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then I saw it, a flash of movement in the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. Something large, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. I caught a glimpse of reddish-brown fur, a massive shoulder rolling beneath it. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "This is Ranger Chen. Is someone there?" The only response was another growl, deeper this time, with an almost questioning lilt to it. I took a step back, then another, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the movement. That's when it emerged from the trees. I'd like to say I remained calm and professional, that my years of training kicked in, and I handled the situation with cool composure. But the truth is, when I saw the creature step into the clearing, I nearly wet myself. It was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall on 2 legs. Its body was covered in thick, reddish-brown fur, matted in places and hanging in long strands from its powerful arms. The face was a nightmare blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow, a wide, flat nose, and a mouth full of yellowed teeth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me, deep-set and startlingly intelligent. They fixed on me with an intensity that rooted me to the spot. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch. The legends were real, and it was standing right in front of me. The creature took a step forward, and I instinctively took one back. It cocked its head, studying me with those unnervingly human eyes. Then, to my utter astonishment, it raised one massive hand and pointed at my ranger badge. I looked down at the badge, then back at the creature. You know what this means?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The Sasquatch nodded slowly. It pointed at the badge again, then swept its arm to encompass the clearing and the forest beyond. The realization hit me like a truck. It was telling me this was its territory, that it knew I was some kind of authority, but so was it. We were both guardians of this land, in our own way. Slowly, carefully, I unclipped my radio from my belt. The creature tensed, a low growl rumbling from its chest. "It's okay," I said softly, holding the radio up. "I just need to call this in. People need to know you're here so they can protect you." The Sasquatch's eyes narrowed, and it shook its head vehemently. It pointed at me, then at the radio, then made a slashing motion with its hand. The message was clear: "Don't tell anyone." I stood there, torn between my duty as a ranger and the incredible secret standing before me. If I reported this creature's life would change forever. Scientists, media, hunters, they would descend on these woods like a plague, but if I stayed quiet, I'd be betraying everything my job stood for. The Sasquatch seemed to sense my internal struggle. It took another step forward, and this time I held my ground. Slowly, gently, it reached out and placed one massive hand on my shoulder. The touch was surprisingly soft, almost comforting. In that moment, looking into those ancient, knowing eyes, I made my decision. I clipped the radio back onto my belt. "Okay," I said softly, "your secret is safe with me, but you have to promise me something." The creature cocked its head, listening. "You can't let anyone else see you, and you need to be more careful with the trees. People are starting to notice." To my amazement, the Sasquatch nodded. Then, moving with that surprising grace, it turned and loped back into the forest. At the edge of the clearing, it paused and looked back at me one last time. I could have sworn I saw the faintest hint of a smile on its face. Then it was gone, melting into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stood in that clearing for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But the twisted trees around me and the massive footprints in the dirt were proof that it had been real. As I hiked back to my truck, my mind raced with questions. How long had the Sasquatch been living in these woods? Were there more of them? And how many other rangers had encountered them over the years, keeping their silence just as I now would? I reported that I had found some unusual tree damage, probably caused by a storm, but nothing else of note. My supervisor seemed satisfied, and the case was closed. But I've been back to that clearing many times since that day. Sometimes I find new trees twisted into impossible shapes. Once, I found a pile of fresh berries placed on a stump, as if left there as a gift, and sometimes when the forest is quiet and the light is just right, I catch a glimpse of a large, fur-covered figure moving through the trees. I've kept my promise. I haven't told anyone about what I saw that day, but I've dedicated myself to protecting that remote corner of the forest with a newfound passion, because I know now that I'm not just preserving nature, I'm guarding an incredible secret, a living legend that walks among the trees. So the next time you're hiking in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, like you're being watched, remember this: not all the old stories are just stories. Sometimes the monsters in the shadows aren't monsters at all. They're the true guardians of the wild places, watching over their domain just as they have for thousands of years. And if you're very, very lucky, you might just catch a glimpse of them. Story 18. The moment I saw those glowing eyes in my night vision camera feed, I knew this was no ordinary wildlife encounter. But it wasn't until I played back the footage and heard that impossible, guttural voice growling, "Go away," that I realized I'd stumbled into something far beyond the realm of known science. By then, it was already too late. My name is Dr. Alex Harker, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in large mammal behavior. For the past 15 years, I've been setting up camera traps and conducting field research in some of the most remote corners of North America. I've had close encounters with grizzlies, tracked wolf packs through blizzards, and even had a face-to-face standoff with a mountain lion. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It all started as a routine research expedition. There had been an uptick in reported sightings of unusually large animals in the area, along with some grainy photos that didn't quite match any known species. The university had secured funding for a 6-month study, and I jumped at the chance to investigate. I arrived at the research site on a crisp autumn morning, my truck loaded down with high-tech camera traps, audio recorders, and enough supplies to last for weeks in the backcountry. As I set up my base camp, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to the usual unease of being alone in the wilderness and focused on my work. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked the surrounding area, setting up cameras and audio recorders at strategic locations based on the reported sightings and my own assessment of likely animal routes. The forest was beautiful, all towering cedars and moss-draped firs, but unnervingly quiet. I rarely heard bird calls or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, unusual for such a seemingly pristine ecosystem. It was on the 4th night that things took a turn for the strange. I was reviewing the day's camera footage on my laptop when I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart race. In one frame, barely visible in the infrared image, was a pair of eyes reflecting the camera's light. They were set too high off the ground to belong to any known predator in the area, and they seemed to glow with an almost intelligent awareness. Intrigued and a bit unnerved, I decided to head out at first light to check the camera in person. Sleep didn't come easily that night, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and glowing eyes. The next morning, I hiked out to the camera location, my senses on high alert. As I approached the site, I immediately knew something was wrong. The camera, which had been securely fastened to a tree trunk, was hanging askew, the sturdy metal casing dented as if it had been struck by tremendous force. With shaking hands, I removed the memory card and inserted it into my handheld viewer. What I saw nearly made me drop the device. The night vision footage showed a massive, hair-covered figure approaching the camera. It was bipedal, easily 8 feet tall, with a build that seemed to blend ape-like and human characteristics. The creature examined the camera for a moment, its eyes glowing eerily in the infrared light. Then, to my utter astonishment, it opened its mouth and spoke. The voice was deep, gravelly, and undeniably inhuman, but the words were clear. "Go away." I stood there for a long moment, trying to process what I'd just seen and heard. My scientific mind raced through possibilities, a hoax, a misidentification, a vivid hallucination brought on by isolation. But deep down, I knew what I'd witnessed was real. As if to confirm my realization, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart pounding, to find myself face to face with the creature from the video. Up close, it was even more impressive and terrifying. Thick, matted fur covered its massive frame, and its face was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. But it was the eyes that truly captivated me, deep-set and startlingly intelligent. They regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. For what felt like an eternity, we simply stared at each other. Then, slowly and deliberately, the creature raised one massive hand and pointed at me, then back the way I had come. The message was clear. Leave. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that my scientific curiosity overcame my fear. But the truth is, I ran. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the noise I was making. I didn't stop until I reached my camp, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. As I slumped against a tree, gasping for breath, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I'd encountered a creature that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. A being that walked the line between man and beast, that could speak, that seemed to possess a level of intelligence far beyond any known animal. I spent a restless night in my tent, jumping at every sound, half expecting to see that massive silhouette looming outside the thin fabric walls. By morning, I'd made a decision. I needed to document this discovery, to share it with the world. This could revolutionize our understanding of evolution, of human origins, of the very nature of intelligence itself. With renewed determination, I set out to gather more evidence. I repositioned cameras, set up audio recorders, and even scattered plaster powder in areas where I hoped to capture footprints. For days, I worked tirelessly, driven by a mixture of scientific zeal and a growing obsession. But as I reviewed each day's data, my excitement turned to frustration. The cameras showed only tantalizing glimpses, a blur of movement here, a shadowy figure there. The audio recorders picked up strange vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, but nothing as clear as that first "go away." It was as if the creature was deliberately avoiding my attempts to document it. Then, on the 7th day since my face-to-face encounter, I returned to my camp to find it in shambles. My tent was torn to shreds, my equipment smashed beyond repair, and there, scratched deep into the trunk of a nearby tree, was a message that chilled me to my core. Last warning. I stood there, staring at those crude letters, as the full weight of my situation crashed down upon me. I wasn't dealing with some undiscovered animal species. This was a sentient being, one that clearly valued its privacy and was willing to enforce it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, I heard a series of wood knocks echoing through the forest. They seemed to come from all around me, a complex rhythm that I instinctively understood as a form of communication. The message was clear. I was surrounded. In that moment, looking at the destroyed remnants of my camp and listening to those ominous knocks, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I left. I grabbed what little undamaged equipment I could carry, hiked back to my truck, and drove away without looking back. The official report I filed claimed that my equipment had been damaged in a storm and that the study area had yielded no significant findings. I deleted the video of the speaking creature and buried the memory card deep in the woods before I left. In the years since that expedition, I've grappled with the consequences of my decision. There are nights when I wake in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman voice growling, "Go away," still ringing in my ears. I've pored over cryptozoology forums, Bigfoot sighting reports, and indigenous legends, searching for any corroboration of what I experienced. I've been tempted so many times to come forward with my story, to share the truth of what I encountered in those woods. But each time I consider it, I'm struck by a deep, instinctive fear. Not just of ridicule or professional ruin, but of something more primal, a fear of violating the trust of a being that chose to reveal itself to me, that gave me a chance to leave its territory in peace. So I've kept my silence. I still work as a wildlife biologist, still venture into the wilderness to study known animal species. But now, when I'm deep in the forest and I feel that prickle on the back of my neck that tells me I'm being watched, I don't dismiss it. I know that there are creatures out there beyond our current scientific understanding, beings that walk the line between legend and reality. And I know that sometimes the most profound discoveries are the ones we choose to keep secret, because in the vast, wild places of the world, there are some mysteries that are better left unsolved, some territories that should remain unexplored. For in those shadows dwell beings far more ancient and intelligent than we might be prepared to accept. So the next time you're in the deep woods and you hear an unexplained sound or catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there, remember this: not all discoveries are meant to be shared. Some secrets belong to the forest itself, guarded by creatures that have watched us from the shadows since the dawn of time. And perhaps, just perhaps, it's better that way. Story 19. The moment I stepped into that perfect circle of dead vegetation, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. The air crackled with an energy that set my teeth on edge, and the eerie silence that blanketed the forest was broken only by my own ragged breathing. But it wasn't until I heard that bone-chilling howl, a sound that seemed to shift between human and beast, that I realized I'd stumbled into something far beyond my understanding or control. My name is Ranger Kate Morrow, and I've been working in Blackwood National Park for over a decade. I thought I knew every inch of these woods, every animal call, every natural phenomenon. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered on that moonless night in late October. It all started with a series of bizarre reports from hikers and campers in the park's northern sector. They spoke of strange lights dancing through the trees, of unearthly noises that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Most disturbing were the accounts of a creature that defied description, sometimes appearing as a man, sometimes as a wolf, but always vanishing before it could be clearly seen. At first, I dismissed these stories as the product of overactive imaginations, fueled by campfire tales and the inherent spookiness of the deep woods. But as the reports continued to pile up, each more unsettling than the last, I knew I had to investigate. I set out just before dusk, my pack loaded with supplies for an overnight stay. The plan was to hike to the area where most of the sightings had occurred, set up camp, and spend the night observing. As I made my way deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds was noticeably absent, and the trees seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. About 3 hours into my hike, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. There, in a small clearing, was a perfect circle of dead vegetation. The grass and wildflowers inside the circle were withered and brown, in stark contrast to the lush greenery surrounding it. I'd seen fairy rings before, but never anything like this. The circle was at least 30 feet in diameter, and the line between dead and living plants was unnaturally precise. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing across the ground. As I neared the edge of the circle, I felt a strange tingling sensation, like static electricity running across my skin. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The effect was immediate and disorienting. The air felt thicker somehow, and the sounds of the forest, what little there had been, became muffled and distant. I swayed on my feet, suddenly dizzy, and that's when I saw the lights. They started as pinpricks in the darkness, like fireflies, but quickly grew in size and intensity. They danced through the trees, weaving complex patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. Colors I couldn't name pulsed and shifted, and I found myself mesmerized, unable to look away. I'm not sure how long I stood there, transfixed by the hypnotic display. It could have been minutes or hours. But I was jolted back to reality by a sound that made my blood run cold, a howl that seemed to come from the very air around me. It started low, almost subsonic, a vibration I felt more than heard. Then it rose in pitch and volume, transforming into something that sounded almost human, a scream of rage or pain or both. But just as quickly, it shifted again, becoming the unmistakable howl of a wolf. Yet it was deeper, more primal than any wolf I'd ever heard. I spun around, my heart pounding, trying to locate the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure that defied explanation. In the shifting, otherworldly light, its form seemed to ripple and change. One moment it appeared to be a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with long, matted hair. But then, in the blink of an eye, it would transform into a massive wolf, its fur bristling and its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I stood frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. This had to be a hallucination, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by the strange energies of this place. But as the creature took a step toward me, I knew with terrifying certainty that this was real. "Who are you?" I managed to stammer, my voice sounding small and weak in the unnatural silence. The creature cocked its head, regarding me with eyes that burned with an ancient intelligence. When it spoke, its voice was a low growl that seemed to resonate in my very bones. "I am the guardian of this place," it said, its form shimmering between man and beast as it spoke. "The keeper of the veil between worlds. And you, little one, have trespassed where you do not belong." I took a step back, my ranger training warring with the primal fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't know. I was just investigating some strange reports." The creature's laugh cut me off, a sound that was equal parts beautiful and terrifying. "Your kind never knows," it said, its voice dripping with disdain. "You push and prod at the boundaries of your world, never understanding the dangers that lie beyond." As it spoke, the lights around us intensified, swirling faster and faster until the entire clearing was awash in a dizzying kaleidoscope of color. I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to shift and warp, as if reality itself was coming undone. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I'll leave. I won't tell anyone what I've seen. Just let me go." The creature regarded me for a long moment, its form settling into something that was neither fully man nor fully wolf, but a terrifying amalgamation of both. Then, to my surprise, it nodded. "You may go," it growled, "but know this. The next time you or any of your kind cross into my domain, there will be no mercy. The veil grows thin, and soon the boundaries between worlds will crumble. When that day comes, all that you know will be unmade." With those ominous words, the creature threw back its head and let out another of those impossible howls. The sound seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality, and I felt myself falling, tumbling through a maelstrom of light and shadow. When I came to my senses, I was lying on the forest floor, miles from where I'd encountered the creature. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a vivid dream, but then I saw the strange symbols burned into the flesh of my forearm, curving lines and angular shapes that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. And I knew that what I'd experienced had been all too real. I never filed an official report about what happened that night. Who would believe me? Instead, I've dedicated myself to patrolling the northern sector of the park, quietly steering hikers and campers away from that otherworldly clearing. On quiet nights, when the moon is dark and the stars seem just a little too bright, I sometimes hear that unearthly howl echoing through the trees, and I wonder how much longer the veil between worlds will hold. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to make sense of what I encountered. I've delved into ancient myths and legends, studied quantum physics theories about parallel universes, and even reached out to a few fringe scholars who specialize in the paranormal. But the more I learn, the more I realize how little we truly understand about the nature of reality. Sometimes, on my patrols, I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be, shadows that move against the wind, lights that dance through the trees in complex patterns, animals that seem to shift and change as they run. And I wonder if the creature was right. If the boundaries between worlds are indeed crumbling, I don't know what the future holds or what will happen when the veil finally falls. But I do know this: there are things in this world and beyond it that defy our understanding, forces and beings that have watched us from the shadows since the dawn of time. And as much as we might think we're the masters of our world, we're really just children playing at the edge of an abyss we can't begin to comprehend. So the next time you're in the deep woods and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you you're being watched, pay attention, because not all monsters are myth, and not all boundaries are meant to be crossed. Some secrets are better left undiscovered, some territories better left unexplored. For in the liminal spaces between what we know and what we fear, there are guardians watching, waiting. And they are not always kind to those who wander where they don't belong. Story 20. It started with the smell. That sick, rotten stench that hits you out of nowhere, so strong it makes your stomach churn. At first, I thought it was a dead animal somewhere nearby, maybe a deer or some other unlucky creature that had met its end in the woods. But the longer I stood there, inhaling that foul, decaying odor, the more I realized something was wrong. It wasn't the smell of an animal, it was worse, and it was moving. I had been working alone in the forest for weeks, conducting wildlife research for a local environmental study. My job was simple: track animal movement, gather data, report findings. I'd done it a dozen times before, but this time something was off. I could feel it. It was in the air, thick and heavy, and the deeper I went into the forest, the stronger that sense of unease grew. At first, it was subtle, a distant feeling like being watched. I'd catch myself stopping mid-step, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone or something watching me from the shadows. But there was never anyone there, just trees, just silence. The forest had a way of playing tricks on your mind, especially when you're alone, miles away from civilization. But I wasn't imagining the smell, and I wasn't imagining the sound that came next. A low, clicking noise, almost like the sound of an insect's wings, but bigger, much bigger. It started faint, barely audible over the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. But as I stood there, listening, it grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind me. I turned, my heart racing, but the forest was still, empty, just the same towering pines, the same dense underbrush. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a coyote, something that had wandered too close. But the smell lingered, thick and putrid, sticking to the back of my throat like bile. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, trying to block it out as I continued down the narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting. I reached a small clearing and decided to set up my gear for the night. The sun was already starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The silence pressed down on me as I unpacked my tent and started a small fire. Normally, being out here alone didn't bother me. In fact, I usually preferred it. There was something peaceful about the isolation, the way the world seemed to shrink down to just you and the trees. But tonight, that peace felt more like suffocation. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me. As the fire crackled and the night closed in around me, the smell came back, stronger than before. It hit me so hard I gagged, nearly dropping the pot of water I'd been heating over the fire. It wasn't just decay anymore, it was worse. The kind of stench that makes your eyes water, that makes your body want to reject it in every possible way. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the trees, searching for the source. That's when I saw it. At first, It was just a glimpse, a shadow shifting between the trees, something large moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I aimed the flashlight at it, but the beam barely penetrated the thick darkness. I could see movement, the shape of something tall, hunched, just beyond the reach of the light, but then it stopped, blending perfectly into the shadows, and I couldn't make out any details. Just that smell, growing stronger, and that sense of dread clawing at my insides. I slowly backed toward the fire, my hand trembling as I reached for the rifle I'd brought with me. I wasn't planning on using it, I never did. But something about the way that thing moved, the way it felt too deliberate, too predatory, made my pulse race with a kind of fear I hadn't felt in years. The clicking sound started again, louder now, closer. It came from the trees, from the shadows circling the edge of the clearing, like whatever was out there was testing me, watching me. I stood frozen, the rifle heavy in my hands, trying to steady my breathing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice tight and shaky. I expected silence, but instead the clicking stopped, replaced by something else, a low, guttural growl. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe a bear or some other animal, but that growl. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, rumbling, vibrating through the air in a way that made my skin crawl. And it wasn't far. It was right there, just outside the firelight, hidden in the trees. I backed up, my foot catching on a root, nearly sending me sprawling into the dirt. I swung the flashlight in every direction, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making that noise. But every time the beam landed on a patch of trees, there was nothing, no movement, just that overwhelming sense that I was being watched. Then the footsteps started, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My pulse spiked, and I raised the rifle, pointing it blindly into the dark. The footsteps circled me, slow, methodical, as if whatever was out there was toying with me. I could feel it moving, feel its presence, but every time I tried to focus on it, it slipped away, blending into the shadows like it was part of the forest itself. The fire crackled, the only sound breaking the suffocating silence. And then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting, listening, and then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to send a jolt of fear through my body. It came from the trees, from the darkness, a single word, my name. It wasn't possible. There was no one out here, no one who knew I was here anyway. But that voice, it was mine. It was like hearing myself speak, but twisted wrong. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. No answer. Just the sound of the fire crackling and the oppressive silence pressing in around me. I took a step back, my flashlight sweeping across the trees again, but still there was nothing. Nothing but that smell, thick and suffocating, and the lingering sound of my name echoing in my mind. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I took a step toward the trees. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity, but something drove me forward, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to know what was out there. I needed to see it. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, my flashlight shaking in my hand, the beam cutting through the darkness. The smell was unbearable now, so strong I could barely breathe without gagging. I felt like I was walking into something I couldn't come back from, but I couldn't stop. And then I saw it. It was standing just beyond the trees, hunched and massive, its back turned to me. Its body was covered in matted fur, patches of skin showing through, raw and red like it had been scraped away. But the worst part was its head, twisted, elongated, not quite animal, but not human either. It turned slowly, too slowly, and when its eyes met mine, I froze. They were hollow, empty, just black pits that seemed to swallow the light, reflecting nothing back. And then it smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that split its face, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand as I raised the rifle. But before I could pull the trigger, it let out a sound, half growl, half laugh, and disappeared. Just like that, vanished into the trees, into the dark, as if it had never been there. The smell lingered, thick and foul, but the thing, whatever it was gone. I didn't stay to find out if it would come back. I grabbed my gear, doused the fire, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, my chest burning, my mind racing. I never reported what I saw. Who would believe me anyway? But I still smell it sometimes, that foul, rotting stench, and I still hear that clicking noise, far off in the distance, like it's waiting. And I know deep down that whatever it was, it's still out there.